Chapter 13 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mrs. Pennington's brougham. There was a general movement of dispersal, and Philip Gallatin, who had now given up all hope of the opportunity Nellie Pennington had promised him, followed the party into the hall, his eyes following Jane, who had found her hostess and was making her adieu. He watched her slender figure as she made her way up the stairs and turned to Mrs. Pennington reproachfully. "Don't speak, Phil," his hostess whispered. "It's all arranged. Go at once and get your things." Gallatin obeyed quickly, and when he came down he heard Mrs. Pennington saying, "So sorry, Jane. Your machine came, but the butler sent it home again. There was some mistake in the orders, it seems, but I've ordered my brougham and it's waiting at the door for you. You don't mind, do you? I've asked Mr. Gallatin to see that you get home safely." "Of course, it's very kind of you, dear." She hesitated. "But it seems too bad to trouble Mr. Gallatin." "I'm sure I'm delighted," he said, and it was evident that he meant it. Jane Loring glanced around her quickly, helplessly it seemed to Gallatin, but the sight of Coleman Van Duyn waiting hat in hand helped her to a decision. "It's so kind of you, Mr. Gallatin," she said gratefully, and then in a whisper as she kissed her hostess, "Nellie, you're simply odious," and made her way out of the door. Gallatin followed quickly, but Miss Loring reached the curb before him and giving her number to the coachman, got in without the proffered hand of her escort. Angry though she was, Jane Loring kept her composure admirably. All the world, it seemed, was conspiring to throw her with this man whom she now knew she must detest. If fate, blind and unthinking, had made him her dinner partner, only design, malicious and uncivil, could be blamed for his presence now. She sat in her corner, her figure tense, her head averted, her wraps carefully drawn about her, a dark and forbidding wraith of outraged dignity, waiting only for him to speak that she might crush him. Gallatin sat immovable for a moment, conscious of all the feminine forces arrayed against him. "I make no apologies," he began, with an assurance which surprised her. "I wanted to see you alone and no other chance offered. I suppose I might say I'm sorry, but that wouldn't be true. I'm not sorry and I don't want any misunderstandings. I asked Mrs. Pennington." "Oh," she broke in wrathfully. "Many people, it seems, enjoy your confidences, Mr. Gallatin." "No," he went on steadily, "I'm not given to confidences, Miss Loring. Mrs. Pennington is one of my oldest and best friends. I told her it was necessary for me to see you alone for a moment, and she took pity on me." "Mrs. Pennington has taken an unpardonable liberty, and I shall tell her so," said Jane decisively. "I hope you won't do that. Have matters reached such a point in New York that a girl can't drive out alone without being open to the importunity of any stranger?" "I am not a stranger," he put in firmly, and his voice dominated hers. "We met within the gates of chance, Miss Loring, on equal terms. I have the right of any man to plead." "You've already pleaded." "You were prejudiced. I've appealed to a higher tribunal, your sense of justice." "I know no law but my own instinct." "You are not true to your own instincts then, or they are not true to you." It was sophistry, of course, but she was a trifle startled at the accuracy of his deduction, for she realized that it was her judgment only that rejected him and that her instincts advised her of the pleasure she took in his company. Her instincts then being unreliable, she followed her judgment blindly, uncomfortably conscious that she did it against her will, and angry with herself that it was so. "I only know, Mr. Gallatin," she said coldly, "that both judgment and instinct warn me against you. Whatever there is left in you of honor, of decency, must surely respond to my distaste for this intrusion." "If I admit that I'm neither honorable nor decent, will you give me the credit for speaking the truth?" he asked slowly. "With reference to what?" scornfully. "To this story they're telling." "You brought it here, of course." "Will you believe me if I say that I didn't?" "Why should I believe you?" "Simply because I ask you to." She looked out of the carriage window, away from him. "I believed in you once, Mr. Gallatin." He bowed his head. "Even that is something," he said. "You wouldn't have believed in me then if instinct had forbidden it. I am the same person you once believed in." "My judgment was at fault. I dislike you intensely." "I won't believe it." "You must. You did me an injury that nothing can repair." "An injury to your dignity, to your womanhood and sensibility." "Hardly," she said scornfully, "or even to my pride. It was only my body. You heard, Mr. Gallatin? Your kisses, they soiled me." "My God, Jane, don't. Haven't you punished me enough? I was mad, I tell you. There was a devil in me that owned me body and soul, that stole my reason, killed what was good, and made a monster of the love that I had cherished, an insensate enemy that perverted and brutalized every decent instinct, a thing unfamiliar to you, which frightened and drove you away with fear and loathing. It was not me you feared, Jane, for you trusted me. It was the thing you feared, as I fear it, the enemy that had pursued me into the woods where I had fled from it." Jane Loring sat in her corner, apparently unconcerned, but her heart was throbbing, and the hands beneath the wide sleeves of her opera kimono were nervously clutched. The sound of his voice, its deep sonorous tones when aroused, were familiar to her. As he paused, she stole a glance at him, for as he spoke of his enemy, he had turned away from her, his eyes peering out into the dimly lighted street, as if the mention of his weakness shamed him. "I'm not asking you for your pity," he went on more steadily. "I only want your pardon. I don't think it's too much to ask. It wasn't the real Phil Gallatin who brought that shame on you." "The real Phil Gallatin? Which is the real Phil Gallatin?" she asked cruelly. "What you make him tonight," he replied quickly. "I've done what I can without you, lived like an outcast on the memories of happiness, but I can't subsist on that. Memory is poor food for a starving man." "I can't see how I can be held accountable. I did not make you, Mr. Gallatin." "But you can mar me. I've come," he remembered the words of Mrs. Pennington, "I've come to the parting of the ways. Up there I gained my self-respect and lost it. The best of me you saw, and the worst of me. You knew me only for 5 days, and yet no one in the world can know me exactly as you do." "The pity of it." "The best of me and the worst of me. The man in me and the beast in me. my sanity and my madness. All these you saw. The record is at least complete." "I hope so." "I could not lie to you nor cheat you with false sentiment. I played the game fairly until then." "Yes, until then." "You cared for me there in the woods. I earned your friendship, and I hoped that the time had come when I could prove to you, at least, that I was not to be found wanting." "And yet you failed," she said. "Yes, I failed. Oh, I don't try to make my sin any the less. I only want you to remember the circumstances, to acquit me of any intention to do you harm. I am no despoiler of women. Even my enemies will tell you so. That, thank God, was not a part of my heritage. I have always looked on women of your sort with a kind of wonder. I have never understood them, nor they me. I thought of them as I thought of pictures or of children, things set apart from the grubby struggle for material and moral existence. I liked to be with them because their ways fell in pleasant places and because, in respecting them, I could better learn to respect myself. God knows I respected you, honored you. Don't say you don't believe that." I think you did," she stammered. "I tried to show you how much. You knew what was in my heart. I would have died for you or lived for you if you could have wished it so." He paused a moment, his brows tangled in thought. "I learned many things up there, things that neither men nor women nor books had taught me. Something of the directness and persistence of the forces of nature, the binding contract of a man's body with his soul, the glorification of labor and the meaning of responsibility. I was happy there, happy as I had never been before. I wanted the days to be longer so that I could work harder for you, and my pride in your comfort was the greatest pride I have ever known. You were my fetish, the symbol of intention. You made me believe in myself and defied the enemy that was plucking at my elbow. I could have lived there always, and I prayed in secret that we might never be found. I wanted you to believe in me as I was already beginning to believe in myself. Whatever I had been here in the world, up there, at least, I was a success. I wanted to prove it thoroughly, to kill that you might eat and be warm, to hew and build that you might be comfortable. I wanted a shrine for you that I might put you there and keep you always. I worshiped you, Jane. God help me as I worship you now." His voice trembled and broke as he paused. I must not listen to you, Mr. Gallatin," she said hurriedly, for her heart was beating wildly. "I worship you, Jane," he repeated, "and I ask for nothing but your pardon." I forgive you," she gasped. "I'm glad of that. I'll try to deserve your indulgence," he said slowly. He stopped again, and it was a long time before he went on. The brougham was moving rapidly up the avenue and the turmoil of night sounds was fading into silence. 42nd Street was already behind them, and the fashionable restaurants were gay with lights. He seemed to realize then that Jane would soon reach her destination, and he went on quickly as though there were still much that he must say in the little time left to him to say it. "I suppose it would be too much if I asked you to let me see you once in a while," he said quickly, as though he feared her refusal. I've no doubt that we'll meet, Mr. Gallatin." "I don't mean that," he persisted. I don't think I'll go around much this winter. I want to talk to you, if you'll let me. I can't give you up. I need you. I need your belief in me, the incentive of your friendship, your spell to exorcise the thing that came between us." "I am trying to forget that," she murmured. "It would be easier if you hadn't said what you did." "What did I say? I don't know," he said passionately. "That you loved me. It was the brute in you that spoke, not the man, the beast that kissed. Oh!" She brushed the back of her hand across her eyes. "It was not you. The memory of it will never go." He hung his head in shame. No, don't," he muttered. "You're crucifying me." "If you had not said that." It was monstrous. It was madness, but it was sweet. "Love is not brutal, does not shame or frighten," she said slowly. "You had been so clean, so calm." "It was Arcadia, Jane," he whispered. "Your Arcadia and mine. It was the love in me that spoke, whatever I said, the love of a man or of a beast, if you like. But it spoke truly. There were no conventions there but those of the forest, no laws but those of the heart. I had known you less than a week, and I had known you always. And you, up there, you loved me. Yes, it's true. Do you think I couldn't read it in your eyes?" No, she protested. "It isn't true. I didn't love you. I don't." He had captured one of her hands and was leaning toward her, his voice close at her ear, vibrant with emotion. "You loved me up there, Jane. The forest knew. The stream sang of it. It was in Keewaydin and the rain. It was part of the primeval when we lived 1,000 years ago. Don't you remember? I read it in your eyes that night when I came in with the deer. You ran out to meet me, like the cave woman to greet her man. I was no longer the fugitive who had built your hut or made your fires. You had learned that I was necessary to you in other ways, not to your body, but to your spirit." "No, it's not true." "That night you fed me, watched by me. I saw your eyes in my dreams, the gentleness in them, their compassion, their perfect womanliness. Such wonderful dreams. And when I awoke you were still there. I wanted to tell you then that I knew, but I couldn't. It would have made things difficult for you. Then I got sick." "Don't, Mr. Gallatin." He had taken her in his arms and held her face so that her lips lay just beneath his own. "Tell me the truth. You loved me then. You love me now. Isn't it so?" Her lips were silent and one small tear trembled on her cheeks, but he kissed it away. "Look up at me, Jane. Answer. Whatever I am, whatever I hope to be, you and I are one, indivisible. It has been so since the beginning. There is no brute in me now, dear. See, I am all tenderness and compassion. One fire burns out another. I'll clean your lips with new kisses, gentle ones, purge off the baser fire. I love you, Jane. And you?" "Yes, Yes," she whispered faintly. "I do love you. I can't help it." "Do you want to help it?" "No, I don't want to help it." "Kiss me, Jane." She raised her moist lips to his and he took them. Past and future whirled about their ears, dinning the alarm, but they could not hear it, for the voice of the present, the wonderful present, was singing in their hearts. The brougham rolled noiselessly on, and they did not know or care. Fifth Avenue was an Elysian field, and their journey could only end in paradise. "Say it again," he whispered. She did. "I can't see your eyes, Jane. I want to see them now. They're like they were up there, aren't they? They're not cold or scornful or mocking as they've been all evening. Not cruel as they were in the park. It's you, isn't it? Really you?" "Yes. What's left of me," she sighed. "It's so sweet," she whispered. "I've dreamed of it, but I didn't think it could ever be. I was afraid of you." "Oh, Jane, how cruel you were." "I had to be. I had to hurt you." "Why?" "Because of my own pain. I wanted to make you suffer as I suffered, only more." "I did. Much more. You're not afraid of me now?" "No, no. I'm not afraid of you. I shouldn't be where I am if I were." He took pains to give her locality a new definiteness. "I'm not what you thought I was?" he asked after that. "No. Yes. That is, I don't know. Jane, I mean, I don't believe I ever thought you anything but what you are." "You blessed child. And what am I?" A person. A dark-haired person with a face." "Is that all?" "No. And an unshaven chin, a soiled flannel shirt and a brown felt hat with 2 holes punched in it." "Have I always been that?" "Yes, always." "You like that person better than you do this one?" "I'm not sure." She straightened suddenly in his arms and drew away to look at him. "Why, I've only known you. I only met you a few hours ago. It's dreadful of me, Mr. Gallatin."
"Phil,"
he corrected. "Phil, then. The suddenness of everything. I'm not quite sure of myself."
"I'm not either. I'm afraid I'll wake up."
"You're not the person with the glowering eyes," she went on, "and the stubbly chin, or the slouch hat and smelly pipe."
"I'm too happy to glower. I couldn't if I wanted to. But I've got the hat and the smelly pipe. I can make the chin stubbly again, if you'll only wait a few days."
"I don't think I'd like it stubbly now." He laughed, but she stopped him again. I wish you'd tell me." She paused and he questioned. "Something bothers me dreadfully."
"What?"
"You didn't think when you came with me tonight that I could be convinced that you could win so easily, did you?"
"No, dear, I didn't.
Quickly, or I shall die of shame."
I had no hope. None at all. I just wanted you to know how things were with me. Thank God you listened."
"How could I do anything else but listen? In a brougham. I couldn't have jumped out into the street. Besides, you might have jumped too."
"I would have," he said grimly.
"It would have made a scene."
"I hadn't thought of that."
"And the coachman. Mrs. Pennington would have known. Oh, don't you see? Mrs. Pennington only introduced us tonight." She drew away from him and looked out of the carriage window. They had reached a neighborhood which was unfamiliar to her, where the houses were smaller and the lights less frequent, and upon the left-hand side there was no park. "There is some mistake," she said, a little bewildered. "We have come a long way." He followed her look and laughed outright. "We're above the park," he said, opening the door, and then to the coachman, "You got the wrong number." 120th, sir," came a voice promptly. 120? Where are we now, Dawson? 110, sir." Gallatin laughed, but Jane had sunk back in her corner in confusion. "I said 70th distinctly," she murmured. "I'm sure I did." "You'd better turn now," said Gallatin to the man. "Where to, sir?" "To the Battery." "Mr. Phil!" cried Jane. "I beg pardon, sir?" said Dawson. Gallatin concealed his delight with difficulty. "We've come too far, Dawson," he said. "Miss Loring lives in 70th Street." "I'm sorry, sir," came a voice. Gallatin shut the door and the vehicle turned. Jane sat very straight in her corner and her fingers were rearranging her disordered hair. "Oh, Phil, I'm shamed. How could I have let him go past?" "There are no numbers on the streets of Paradise." "It must be frightfully late." "Or watches in the pockets of demigods." "Will you be serious?" "Demigods are too happy to be serious." "That poor horse." "A wonderful horse. A horse among horses. But he goes too fast. He'll be there in no time. Can't we take a turn in the park?" He stretched his hand toward the door, but she seized him by the arm. "I forbid it. If Mrs. Pennington knew " She stopped again in consternation. "Phil, do you think that Nellie Pennington " "I don't know. She's a wonderful woman. Keeps amazing horses. Extraordinary coachman." "Could she have told the man to mistake me purposely?" "I think so," he said brazenly. "She's capable of anything anything. Wonderful woman." "Phil, I'll be angry with you." "No, you can't." He took her in his arms again, and she discovered that what he said was true. She didn't want to be angry. Besides, what did it matter about anything or anybody else in the world? "I don't know how this could have happened. I've hated you, Phil," she confessed after a while. "Oh, how I've hated you." "No." "Oh, yes, it's true. I hated you. I really did. You were the living emblem of my disgrace. When you got in here beside me tonight, I loathed you. I'm still angry with myself. I can't understand how I could have yielded so completely." "It all happened 1,000 years ago." "Yes, I know it. Up there. I seem to remember that." "So did I. The same stream, the same rocks, the forest primeval." "And the voices." "Yes. You couldn't change things. They were meant to be from the beginning." She drew closer into his arms and whispered. "It frightens me a little, though." "What?" "That this has happened in spite of me. That I had no power to resist." "Do you want to resist?" "No, not now. Not now." "You make me immortal. There's no need to be frightened for me or for you. The strength of the ages is in me, Jane. I'll win out, dear," he whispered. "I'll win out for you, for us both." "I believe it," she sighed. "It's in you to win. I've known that, too. You must put the enemy to rout, Phil. I'll help you. It's my enemy as well as yours now. We'll face it together. And it will fall. I know it will." He laughed. "God bless you for that. I'm not afraid of it. We've conjured it away already. You've put me in armor, Jane. We'll turn its weapons aside." "Yes, I'm sure of it." She looked up at him, and by the glow of a street lamp he saw that she was afraid no longer, for in her eyes was a light of love and faith unalterable. She could not know, nor did he, that outside in the darkness beside their vehicle, his weapons sheathed, baffled and thwarted for the moment, but still undismayed, strode the enemy. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The junior member. The offices of Kenyon, Hood and Gallatin were in the Mills building and consisted of 6 rooms, 1 for each of the members of the firm and 3 for the clerks, stenographers and library. They were plainly but comfortably furnished and gave no token of extraordinary prosperity or the lack of it. In no sense did they resemble the magnificent suites which were maintained elsewhere in the building by more precocious firms which had discovered the efficacy of the game of bluff and which used it in their business with successful consistency. And yet there was an air of solidity here which indicated a conservatism more to the liking of the class of people who found use for the services of Kenyon, Hood and Gallatin. John Kenyon, the senior member, belonged to that steadily decreasing class of lawyers who look upon their profession as a calling with traditions. He belonged to an older school of practitioners which still clung to the ethics of a bygone generation. The business of many big corporations went up in the elevator which passed before the door of John Kenyon's private office to a floor above, where its emissaries could learn how to take the money that belonged to other people without being jailed, or having been jailed, how they could most quickly be freed to obtain the use of their plunder. But Mr. Kenyon made no effort to divert this tide. He wanted no part of it in his office. The corporate interests which he represented were for the most part those which required his services to resist the depredations planned upstairs. John Kenyon would have been a great lawyer but for the lack of one important ingredient of greatness, imagination. His knowledge of the law was extraordinary. His mind was crystal clear, analytical but not inventive, judicial but not prophetic. He would have graced the robes of a justice of the Supreme Bench. But as a potent force in modern affairs, he was not far from mediocrity. He had begun his career in the office of Philip Gallatin's grandfather, had been associated with Philip Gallatin's father, but with the passing of the old firm, he had opened offices of his own. The initiative which he lacked had been supplied by Gordon Hood, a brisk Bostonian of the omniscient type, and the accession of young Philip Gallatin 4 years ago had done still more to supply the ingredients which modern conditions seemed to require. It had meant much to John Kenyon to have Phil in the firm, for the perspective of time had done little to dim the luster which hung about the name of Gallatin, and the junior member had shown early signs that he, too, was possessed of much of the genius of his forebears. Kenyon had watched the development of the boy with mingled delight and apprehension, and, with the memory of the failings of his ancestors fresh in his mind, had done what he could to avert impending evil. It was at his advice that young Gallatin had gone to the Canadian woods, and he had noticed with interest and not a little curiosity his return to his desk 2 months ago, sobered and invigorated. Phil had plunged into the work which awaited him with quiet intention, and the way he had taken hold of his problems and solved them had filled the senior partner with new hopes for his future. He loved the boy as he could have loved a son, as he must love the son of Evelyn Westervelt. And it had taken much to destroy John Kenyon's belief in Phil's ultimate success. But this last failure had broken that faith. Through the efforts of Gordon Hood, the firm had won the suit for which Phil Gallatin had prepared it, but it was an empty victory to John Kenyon, who had seen during the preparation of the case Phil Gallatin's chance, his palingenesis, the restitution of all his rights, physical and moral. Fully aware of John Kenyon's attitude toward him, for 2 weeks Philip Gallatin had remained uptown, and until his dinner at Mrs. Pennington's, to which he had gone in response to especial pleading, had hidden himself even from his intimates. He had sent word to John Kenyon that he was indisposed, but both men knew what his absence meant. John Kenyon had been the one rock to which Phil Gallatin had tied, the one man with whom he had been willing to talk of himself, the one man of all his friends from whom he would even take a reproach. It was on John Kenyon's account, more even than on his own, that Gallatin so keenly suffered for his failure at the critical moment. The time had indeed come for a reckoning, and yesterday Gallatin had planned to retire from the firm and save his senior partner the pains of further responsibility on his account. He had been weighed in the balance, a generous balance, with weights which favored him, and had been found wanting. But last night a miracle had happened, and the visit of renunciation which he had even planned for this very morning had been turned into one of contrition and appeal. And difficult as he found the interview before him, he entered the office with a light step and a face aglow with the new resolution which had banished the somber shadow that for so long had hung about him. It was early, and the business of the day had just begun. At his appearance, several of the stenographers looked up from their work and scrutinized him with interest, and the chief clerk rose and greeted him. "Good morning, Tooker," he nodded cheerfully. "Is Mr. Kenyon in yet?" "No, sir. It's hardly his time." "Please tell him I'd like to see him if he can spare me a moment." Then he entered a door which bore his name and closed it carefully behind him, opened his desk, glanced at his watch, made 2 or 3 turns up and down the room, and then took up the telephone book. Logan, Lord, Lorimer, Loring. There it was. 7000 Plaza. He hesitated again, then rang up the number. It was some moments before the butler consented to get Miss Loring, and when he did, she did not recognize his voice. "Who is it?" she asked. "Can't you guess?" "Oh, Phil, I didn't know you at all. Where are you?" "At the office." "Already? And I'm not out of bed." "Did I wake you? I'm sorry." "I'm glad. I didn't mean to go to sleep, but I did sleep somehow." "I haven't been asleep. I couldn't." "Why not?"
"It's so much pleasanter to be awake."
"I think so, too. But then I dreamed, Phil."
"Pleasant dreams?"
"Oh, beautiful ones, full of demigods and things."
"What things?"
"Enchanted broughams. Oh, how did it happen, Phil?"
"It had to happen."
"I can't believe it yet."
He laughed. "If I were there, I'd try to convince you."
"Yes, I think you could. I'm willing to admit that."
"Are you sorry?"
"No, but I'm so used to being myself. I can't understand. It's strange, that's all. And I'm glad you called me. I've had a terrifying feeling that you must be somebody else, too."
"I am somebody else."
"I mean somebody I don't know very well."
"There's a remedy for that."
"What?"
"Doses of demigod. Repeat every hour."
"Oh."
"Don't you like the prescription?"
I think so."
"Then why not try it?"
I think I ought to, oughtn't I?"
"I'm sure of it. In a day or so the symptoms you speak of will entirely disappear."
"Are you sure?"
"Positive."
I think they're less acute already. You really are you, aren't you?"
"If I wasn't, you wouldn't be you, don't you see?"
"Yes, and I'd be frightfully jealous if I had been somebody else." She laughed. "Oh, Phil, what a conversation. I hope no one is listening."
"I'm sure they're not. They couldn't understand anyway."
"Not unless they were quite mad, as we are. What are you doing? Working?"
"Yes. Drawing a deed for an acre in Paradise."
"Don't be foolish. Who for?"
"Me. And there's a deed of trust."
"I'll sign that."
"We'll both sign it. It's well secured, Jane. Don't you believe me?"
"Yes, I do," slowly. There was a pause and then he asked,
"When can I see you?"
"Soon."
"This afternoon?"
"I've a luncheon."
"And then?"
"Tea at the Oh, Phil, I'll have to cut that. There's a dance tonight, too, the Ledyards."
"This is getting serious."
"What can I do? I've been frightfully rude already. Can't you go?"
"Not sufficiently urged."
"Then I shan't either. I don't want to go. I want the acre of paradise."
"Where will I meet you, Jane?"
"Here at 4.
"I'll be there."
Until then, good bye. And Phil?"
"Yes?"
"Please wear that flannel shirt, disreputable hat and
"And the beard?"
No, not the beard. But I want to be convinced there's no mistake."
"I'd rather convince you without them."
"Oh, I've no doubt you will," she sighed. "There's so much I've got to say to you, Phil. I won't know where to begin."
"Just where you stopped."
"But I wasn't saying anything just then. I couldn't. There were reasons."
He laughed gaily. "I've still other reasons."
"Oh."
"Convincing ones."
"Phil, I won't listen. Good bye."
"Good bye."
"Hadn't we better go for a walk?" she asked.
"No, please."
"Oh, very well,"
with a tone of resignation.
"There, you see, I'm submitting again. At 4 then. Good bye." She cut off and he hung up the receiver, sitting for a long while motionless, looking out of the window. He took out his watch and was examining it impatiently when the chief clerk came in. "Mr. Kenyon will see you now, Mr. Gallatin," he said. John Kenyon paused in the reading of his mail and looked up over the half moons in his glasses when Gallatin appeared at the door. "Come in, Phil," he said quietly, offering his hand. He sat down at his desk again and formally indicated the chair nearest it. His manner was kindly and full of an old-fashioned dignity, indicating neither indifference nor encouragement, and this seemed to make Philip Gallatin's position, if anything, more difficult and painful. Instead of sitting, Gallatin turned toward the window and stood there. "I've come back, Uncle John," he muttered. Kenyon glanced up at him, the calm, judicial glance of a man who, having no venal faults himself, tolerates them in others with difficulty. There was no family relationship between the men, and Gallatin's use of the familiar term at this time meant much. And something in Phil Gallatin's pose arrested Kenyon's eye. The jaw that had worked forward and was now clamped tightly by its throbbing muscles, the bulk of the squared shoulders, and the decision with which one hand clasped the chair back. "I'm glad of that, Phil," he said. "I was on the point of thinking you had given me up." I had given you up. I haven't been down here because I knew it wasn't necessary for me to come, and because I thought you'd understand." "I understood." "I wrote you 2 or 3 letters, but I tore them up. I wanted to sever my connection with the firm. I wanted to save you the pain of thinking about me any longer. I knew that I hadn't any right here, that I haven't had any right here for a long while, 2 or 3 years, that I had been taking my share of fees I had never earned, and that it was only through your friendship for me that I've been encouraged to stay as long as this. I wanted to save you the pain of talking to me again." "I've never denied you my friendship, Phil. I don't deny it now. I only thought that you might have." Gallatin turned swiftly and raised his hand. "Don't, Mr. Kenyon. For God's sake, don't reproach me," he said ardently. "Reproaches won't help me, only wound. They've already been ringing in my ears for days, since the last time." He paused. "Never mind." Gallatin strode the length of the room, struggling for the control of his voice, and when he came back it was to stand facing the senior partner quite composed. "There isn't a man in the world who would do as much for one who merited so little. I'm not going over that. Words can't mean much from me to you. But what I would like you to know is that I don't want to go out of the firm, and that, if you'll bear with me, I want another chance to prove myself. I've never promised anything. You've never asked me to. Thank God that much of my self-respect at least is saved out of the ruins. I want to give my word now." "Don't do that," said Kenyon hurriedly. "It isn't necessary." "Yes, I must. I've given it to myself, and I'll keep it. Never fear. That was the last, the very last." Kenyon twisted his thin body in his chair and looked up at the junior member keenly, but as he did so his eyes blurred and he saw, as 30 years ago he had seen the figure of this boy's father, standing as Phil Gallatin was standing, enmeshed in the toils of fate, gifted, handsome, lovable, and yet doomed to go a mental and physical ruin before his time. The resemblance of Philip Gallatin to his father was striking. The same high forehead, heavy brows, and deep-set eyes, the same cleanly cut aquiline nose and heavy chin. There were lines, too, in Phil Gallatin's face, lines which had appeared in the last 2 years, which made the resemblance even more assured. And yet to John Kenyon there seemed to be a difference. There was something of Evelyn Westervelt in him, too, the clean, straight line of the jawbone and the firmly modeled lips, thinner than the father's and more decisive. "I'm glad of that, Phil," he said slowly. "I'm not asking you to believe in me again. Broken faith can't be repaired by phrases. I don't want you to believe in me until I've made good. I want to come in here again on sufferance, as you took me in 6 years ago, without a share in the business of the firm that I don't make myself, or for which I don't give my services. I want to begin at the bottom of the ladder again and climb it rung by rung." "Oh, I can't listen to that. Our partnership agreement." "That agreement is canceled. I don't want a partnership agreement. It's got to be so. I've been thinking hard, Mr. Kenyon. It's responsibility I need." "You're talking nonsense, Phil. You did more work in the Marvin case than either Hood or myself." "Perhaps, but I didn't win it," he said quickly. "The firm did." "I can't agree with you. I'll come in this office on the conditions I suggest, or I must withdraw. My mind is made up on that. I don't want to go, and it won't be easier for me anywhere else. This is where I belong. This is where I want to fight my battle. If I can do it in my own way, without the moral or financial help of anyone, of you least of all." Gallatin paused and walked, his head bent, the length of the room. John Kenyon followed him with his eyes, then turned to the window and for a long while remained motionless. Philip Gallatin returned to the vacant chair and sat leaning forward eagerly. The senior partner turned at last, his kind, homely face alight with a smile. "You don't need my faith, my boy, if you've got faith of your own, but I'll give it to you gladly. Give me your hand." He got up and the two men clasped hands, and Phil Gallatin's eyes did not flicker or fade before the searching gaze of the other man. It was a pact, none the less solemn for the silence with which one of them entered into it. "You're awake, Phil?" he asked. "Yes, that's it, Uncle John." "Awake?" said Gallatin. "I'm glad. I'm very glad. And I believe it. I've never been able to get used to the idea of your being really out of here. We'll need you, my boy. And I've got work for you of the kind that will put your mettle to the test. There's a great opportunity in it, and I'll gladly turn it over to you. Siquitur ad astra, my boy. Will you take it?" "Gladly. A corporation case?" "Sanborn et al. Versus the Sanborn Mining Company. Sit here and I'll explain it to you." End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Discovered. Women have a code of their own, a system of signals, a lip and sign language perfectly intelligible among themselves, but mystifying, as they purpose it to be, to mere man. Overweening husbands, with a fine air of letting the cat out of the bag, have been known to whisper that these carefully guarded secrets are no secrets at all, and that women are merely children of a larger growth, playing at hide and seek with one another and with their common enemy for the mere love of the game, that there are no mysteries in their natures to be solved, and that the vaunted woman's instinct, like the child's, is as apt to be wrong as often as it is right. Of course, no one believes in this, and even if one did, man would go his way and woman hers. Woman would continue to believe in the accuracy of her intuitions, and man would continue to marvel at them. Woman would continue to play at hide and seek, and man would continue to enjoy the game. Call them by what name you please, instinct, intuition, or guesswork. Mrs. Richard Pennington had succeeded by methods entirely feminine in discovering that Phil Gallatin's dryad was Jane Loring, that he was badly in love with her, and that Jane was not indifferent to his attentions. Phil Gallatin had not been difficult to read, and Mrs. Pennington took a greater pride in the discovery of Jane's share in the romance, for she knew when Jane left her house in company with Phil that her intuition had not erred. Jane Loring had kissed her on both cheeks and called her odious. This in itself was almost enough, but to complete the chain of evidence, she learned that Dawson, her head coachman, in the course of execution of her orders, had gone as far north as 125th Street before his unfortunate mistake of Miss Loring's number had been discovered by the occupants of the brougham. Mrs. Pennington realized that this last bit of evidence had been obtained at the expense of a breach of hospitality, for she was not a woman who made a practice of talking with her servants, but she was sure that the ends had justified the means, and the complete success of her maneuver more than compensated for her slight loss of self-respect in its accomplishment. But while her discovery pleased her, she was not without a sense of responsibility in the matter. She had been hoping for a year that a girl of the right kind would come between Phil and the fate he seemed to be courting, for since his mother's death he had lived alone, and seclusion was not good for men of his habits. She had wanted Phil to meet Jane Loring, and her object in bringing them together had been expressed in a definite hope that they would learn to like each other a great deal. But now that she knew what their relations were, she was slightly oppressed by the thought of unpleasant possibilities. It was in the midst of these reflections that Miss Jaffray was announced, and in a moment she entered the room with a long, half mannish, half feline stride, and took up her place before the mantelpiece, where she stood, her feet apart, toasting her back at the open fire. Mrs. Pennington indicated the cigarettes, and Nina Jaffray took one, rolling it in her fingers and tapping the end of it on her wrist to shake out the loose dust as a man would do. "I'm flattered, Nina," said Nellie Pennington. "To what virtue of mine am I indebted for the earliness of this visit?" "I slept badly," said Nina laconically. "And I'm the anodyne?" "Thanks." "Oh, no, merely an antidote." "For what?" "Myself. I've got the blues." "You? Impossible." "Oh, yes, it's quite true. I'm quite wretched." "Dressmaker or milliner?" "Neither. Just bored, I think. You know I've been out 5 years now. Think of it, and I'm 24. Isn't that enough to make an angel weep?" "It's too sad to mention," said Mrs. Pennington. "You used to be such a nice little thing, too." Nina Jaffray raised a hand in protest. "Don't, Nellie. It's no joke. I can tell you I'm not a nice little thing any longer, and I know it. I'm a hoydenish, hard-riding, loud-spoken vixen, and that's the truth. I wish I was a nice little thing, as you call it, like Jane Loring, for instance, with illusions and hopes and a proclivity for virtue. I'm not. I like the talk of men." "That's not unnatural. So do I." "I mean the talk of men among men. They interest me, more what they say than what they are. They're genuine somehow. You can get the worst and the best of them at a sitting. One can't do that with women. Most of us are forever purring and pawing and my dearing one another when we know that what we want to do is to spit and claw. I like the easy ways of men, collectively, Nellie, not individually. And I've come and gone among them because it seemed the most natural thing in the world to do. I've made a mistake. I know it now. When a girl gets to be a good fellow, she does it at the expense either of her femininity or her morals, and men make the distinction without difficulty. I'm a good fellow. she said scornfully. "And I'm decent. Men know it, but they know, too, that I have no individual appeal. Why, only last week at the breakfast the Sackett boy clapped me on the back and called me a jolly fine chap. I put him down, I can tell you. I'd rather he'd called me anything, even something dreadful, if it had only been feminine." She flicked her cigarette into the fire and dropped into a chair. Mrs. Pennington laughed. "All this is very unmanly of you, Nina." "Oh, I'm not joking. You're like the others. Just because I've ridden through life with a light hand, you think I'm in no danger of a cropper. Well, I am. I've had too light a hand, and I'm out in the backstretch with a winded horse. You didn't make that mistake, Nellie. Why couldn't you have warned me?" Mrs. Pennington held off the embroidery frame at an arm's length and examined it with interest. "You didn't ask me to, Nina," she replied quietly. "No, I didn't. I never ask advice. When I do, it's only to do the other thing. But you might have offered it just the same." "I might have, if I knew you wouldn't have followed it. No," reflectively, "I think I'd have done what you said. I like you immensely, you know, Nellie. You're a good sort, besides being everything I'm not." "Meaning what?" "Oh, I don't know. You're all woman for one thing." "I have had 2 children," smiled the other toward the ceiling. "I could hardly be anything else." "Is that it?" asked the visitor, and then after a pause, "I don't like children." "Not other people's. You'd adore your own." "I wonder." Mrs. Pennington's pretty shoulders gave an expressive shrug. "Marry, my dear. Nothing defines one's sex so accurately. Marry for love if you can, marry for money if you must, but marry just the same. You may be unhappy, but you'll never be bored." Nina Jaffray gazed long into the fire. "I've been thinking about it," she said. "That's what I came to see you about." "Oh, Nina, I'm delighted," cried Nellie Pennington genuinely. "And so flattered. Who, my dear child?" "I've been thinking seriously." "You must have had dozens of offers." "Oh, yes, from fortune hunters and gentlemen jockeys. But I'm not a philanthropic institution. Curiously enough, my taste is quite conventional. I want a New Yorker, a man with a mind, with a future, perhaps, neither a prig nor a rake, human enough not to be too good, decent enough not to be burdensome, a man with weaknesses, if you like, a poor man, perhaps." "Nina, who?" Miss Jaffray paused. "I thought I'd marry Phil Gallatin," she said quietly. Mrs. Pennington laid her embroidery frame down and looked up quickly. Nina Jaffray's long legs were extended toward the blaze, but her head was lowered and her eyes gazed steadily before her. It was easily to be seen that she was quite serious, more serious than Mrs. Pennington liked. "Phil Gallatin? Oh, Nina, you can't mean it." "I do. There isn't a man in New York I'd rather marry than Phil." "Does he know it?" "No, but I mean that he shall." "Don't be foolish. You two would end in the ditch in no time." Nina straightened and examined her hostess calmly. "Do you think so?" she asked at last. "Yes, I think so." Nellie Pennington paused, and whatever it was that she had in mind to say remained unspoken. Instinct had already warned her that Nina was the kind of girl who is only encouraged by obstacles, and it was not her duty to impose them. "Stranger things have happened, Nellie," she laughed. "But are you sure Phil will accept you?" "Oh, no, and I shan't be discouraged if he refuses," she went on, oblivious of Nellie Pennington's humor. "Then you do mean to speak to him?" "Of course." Nina's eyes showed only grave surprise at the question. "How should he know otherwise? Your methods are nothing if not direct. Phil would never guess unless I told him. For a clever man, he's singularly stupid about women. I think that's why I like him. Why shouldn't I tell him? What's the use of beating around the bush? It's such a waste of time and energy." Mrs. Pennington's laugh threw discretion to the winds. "Oh, Nina, you'll be the death of me yet. There never was such a passion since the beginning of time." "I didn't say I loved Phil Gallatin," corrected Nina promptly. "I said I decided to marry him." "And have you any reason to suppose that he shares your nubile emotions?" "None whatever. He has always been quite indifferent to me, to all women. I think the arrangement might be advantageous to him. He's quite poor and I've got more money than I know what to do with. He's not a fool and Nellie, I'm not old looking or ugly, am I? Why shouldn't he like me, if he doesn't like anyone else? No reason in the world, dear. I'd marry you if I were a man." Mrs. Pennington took to cover uneasily, conscious that here was a situation over which she could have no control. She was not in Phil Gallatin's confidence or in Jane Loring's, and the only kind of discouragement she could offer must fail of effectiveness with a girl who all her life had done everything in the world that she wanted to do, and who had apparently decided that what she now wanted was Phil Gallatin. Nina's plans would have been amusing had they not been rather pathetic, for Nellie Pennington had sought and found below her visitor's calm exterior a vein of seriousness, of regret and self-reproach, which was not to be diverted by the usual methods. Did she really care for Phil? Clever as Mrs. Pennington was, she could not answer that. But she knew that it was a part of Nina Jaffray's methods to do the unexpected thing, so that her sincerity was therefore always open to question. Nellie Pennington took the benefit of that doubt. "Has it occurred to you, Nina, that he may care for some one else?" Her visitor turned quickly. "You don't think so, do you?" she asked sharply. "How should I know?" Mrs. Pennington evaded. "I've thought of that, Nellie. Who was Phil's wood nymph? He's very secretive about it. I wonder why." "I don't believe there was a wood nymph," said Mrs. Pennington slowly. "Besides, Phil would hardly be in love with that sort of girl." "That's just the point. What sort of a girl was she? What reason could Phil have for keeping the thing a secret? Was it an amourette? If it was, then it's Phil Gallatin's business and nobody else's. But if the girl was one of Phil's own class and station, like Miss Loring," announced the French maid softly from the doorway. Nina Jaffray paused and an expression of annoyance crossed her face. She straightened slowly in her chair, then rose and walked across the room. Mrs. Pennington hoped that she would go, but she only took another cigarette and lit it carefully. "You're too popular, Nellie," she said, taking a chair by the fire. Mrs. Pennington raised a protesting hand. "Don't say that, Nina. For years I've been dreading that adjective. When a woman finds herself popular with her own sex, it means that she's either too passé to be dangerous, too staid to be interesting, or too stupid to be either. Morning, Jane. So glad. Is it chilly out, or are those cheeks your impersonal expression of the joy of living?" "Both, you lazy creature. How do you do, Nina? This is my dinner call, Mrs. Pennington. I simply couldn't wait to be formal." "I'm glad, dear." And then mischievously, "Did you get home safely?" "Oh, yes. But it was a pity to take poor Mr. Gallatin so far out of his way," she replied carelessly. "Poor Phil. That's the fate of these stupid, ineligible bachelors, to act as postilion to the chariot of Venus. Awfully nice boy, but so uninteresting at times." "Is he? I thought him very attractive," said Jane. "He's one of the Gallatins, isn't he?" "Yes, dear, the last of them. I was afraid you wouldn't like him." "Oh, yes, I do. Quite a great deal. He's a friend of yours, isn't he, Nina?" "I've known him for ages," said Miss Jaffray dryly, and then to Mrs. Pennington, "Why shouldn't Jane like him, Nellie?" "Oh, I don't know," she finished with a gesture of graceful retirement. Their game of hide and seek was amusing but hazardous in the present company, so she quickly turned the conversation into other channels. Nina Jaffray and Jane Loring had met in the late autumn at a house party at the Ledyards' place in Virginia, and while their natures were hardly concordant, each had found in the other some ingredients which made for amiability. Jane's interest had been dictated by curiosity rather than approval, for Nina Jaffray was like no other girl she had ever met before. Whatever her manners, and these Jane discovered could be atrocious, her instincts were good and her intentions seemed of the best. To Miss Jaffray, Jane Loring was a nice little thing who had shown a disposition not to interfere with other people's plans, a nice little thing, amiable and a trifle prudish, for whom Nina's kind of men hadn't seemed to care. They had not been and could never be intimate, but upon a basis of good fellowship they existed with mutual toleration and regard. Nellie Pennington from her shadowed corner watched the two girls with the keenest of interest and curiosity. Nina Jaffray sat with hands clasped around one upraised knee, her head on one side, listening carelessly to Jane's enthusiastic account of the Ledyards' ball, commenting only in monosyllables, but interested in spite of herself in Jane's ingenuous point of view, aware in her own heart of a slight sense of envy that she no longer possessed a susceptibility to those fresh impressions. Nina was not pretty this morning, Nellie Pennington thought. Hers was the effectiveness of midnight, which requires a spotlight and accessories, and unless in the hunting field, midday was unkind to her, while Jane, who had danced late, brought with her all the freshness of early blossoms. But she liked Nina, and that remarkable confession, however stagey and Nina-esque, had set her thinking about Jane Loring and Mr. Gallatin. It was a pretty triangle and promised interesting possibilities. Jane was still speaking when Nina interrupted as though through all that she had heard, one train of thought had persisted. "What did you mean, Nellie, about Phil Gallatin being ineligible?" she asked. "And I know you don't think him stupid. And why shouldn't Jane Loring like him? I don't think I understand." Nellie Pennington smiled. She had made a mistake. Hide and seek as a game depends for its success upon the elimination of the bystander. "I am afraid, of course, that Jane would be falling in love with him," she said lightly. And then, "That would have been a pity, don't you think so, Nina?" "There's hardly a danger of that," laughed Jane, "seeing that I've just been introduced to the man. You needn't be at all afraid, Nina. I'm not. Besides, he's awfully gone on a wood nymph. You saw him blush when I spoke of it at dinner here, didn't you, Jane?" "Yes, I did," said Jane, now quite rosy herself. Phil wouldn't have blushed, you know," said Nina confidently, "unless he was terribly rattled. He was rattled. That's what I can't understand. Suppose he did find a girl who was lost in the woods. What of it? It's nobody's business but his own and the girl's. I'd be furious if people talked about me the way they're talking about Phil and that girl. I was lost once in the Adirondacks. You were, too, in Canada only last summer, Jane. You told me so down in Virginia and—" Jane Loring had struggled hard to control her emotion and bent her head forward to conceal her discomposure, but Nina's eyes caught the rising color which had flowed to the very tips of her ears. "Jane!" cried Nina in sharp accents of amazed discovery. "It was you!" The game of hide and seek had terminated disastrously for Jane, and her system of signals, useful to deceive as well as reveal, had betrayed her. It was clearly to be seen that further dissimulation would be futile, so she raised her head slowly, the color gone from her cheeks. "Yes, it was I," she said with admirable coolness. "Meeting Mr. Gallatin here the other night reminded me of it. That was one of the things I came to tell Mrs. Pennington this morning. But I don't suppose there's any reason why you shouldn't know it, too, Nina. If it hadn't been for Mr. Gallatin, I know I should have died. You see, I had slipped and wrenched my ankle and, of course, couldn't move." "It must have been terrible," put in Nellie Pennington in dire distress. "You poor child." "I haven't spoken of it," Jane went on hurriedly, "because there wasn't any reason why I should. But now, of course, that this story is going the rounds, it's just as well that people knew. It wasn't necessary to tell Mr. Gallatin my name up there, and until he met me in New York he did not know who I was. That, of course, is why the whole thing has seemed so mysterious." She paused and smiled rather obtrusively at her companions. "It's really a very trivial matter to make such a fuss about, isn't it?" "Absurd," said Mrs. Pennington with enthusiasm. "I wouldn't worry about it in the least." "It does sound rather romantic, though," laughed Jane uneasily. "But it wasn't a bit. We nearly starved and poor Mr. Gallatin was almost dead with fatigue when they found us." "Who found you?" asked Miss Jaffray. "The guides, of course." "Oh," said Nina. Nellie Pennington put down her embroidery and rose. This wouldn't do. "Jane," she said, laughing, "you make me wild with envy. You're a person to whom all sorts of interesting things are always happening. And now I hear you're engaged to Coleman Van Duyn. Come, child, sit here and tell me all about it. It's not true. I'm very flattered, of course, but you'd better admit it. Nina won't tell. Will you, Nina?" But Miss Jaffray had risen and was drawing on her gloves. "Oh, no, I wouldn't tell. Besides, you know, I don't believe it." She glanced at the clock and brushed a speck from her sleeve. "I think I'll be going on," she said. "Good bye, Jane. Nellie, I'll see you at the Pot and Kettle, won't I?" and went out of the room. Mrs. Pennington followed her to the upper landing and when she had gone, returned thoughtfully to the room. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Behind the enemy's back. As she turned and came into the room again, Jane Loring met her in the middle of the rug, seized her in her arms, kissed her rapturously on both cheeks, and confessed, though not without some hesitation, the object of her visit. Nellie Pennington led her to a divan near the window, and seated there, holding one of her visitor's hands in both of hers, listened enchanted to the full tale of Jane's romance. Her delight was undisguised, for Nina Jaffray's rather frigid exit had already been forgotten by them both. "Oh, Nellie, I'm so happy. I simply had to tell somebody. I wanted to come here yesterday, but I couldn't muster up the courage." "And I'm not really odious?" asked Mrs. Pennington. "No, no," laughed Jane. "You're a sister to the angels. I hated him, Nellie, that night. I would have died rather than let him know I cared for him. And yet I did let him know it. Love and hate are first cousins. Love hates because it's afraid, Jane." "Yes, that's true. I was afraid of myself, of him. Not now. No," proudly. "Not even of fate itself. We'll face whatever is to come together. I believe in him utterly." Nellie Pennington kissed her. "So do I, Jane. I always have. And in you. I can't tell you how glad I am that you have told me all this. Flattered too, child. I'm rather worldly wise, perhaps even more so than your mother." "I haven't told mother," Jane put in with sudden demureness. "Take my advice and do so immediately. Omit nothing. Your mother must put a stop to this story by telling the truth. Mother, you know, had hoped that I would marry Coleman Van Duyn. She doesn't approve of Phil, and father—" Jane paused as she remembered her father's estimate of Phil Gallatin. "And neither does my father," she finished thoughtfully. "Oh, it will work out some way. Such things do. But tell them at once." "I think I had already decided that. But it isn't going to be easy. With me, with mother, my father is the soul of kindness. But with men—" she paused. "Phil must take his chance." "Yes, but father must respect him." "Phil must earn his respect." Jane was silent for a moment. "My father has a sharp tongue at times," she went on. "He has mentioned Phil Gallatin's name unpleasantly. I couldn't stand hearing him spoken about in that way. I couldn't listen. I couldn't tolerate it, even from my father. I have made a decision and father must abide by it. He must accept Phil as I have accepted him. I am satisfied. A man's past is his own. He can only give a girl his future. I used to think differently, but I'm content with that. Phil's future is mine, and I'll take my half of it, whatever it is." At the mention of her father, Jane had risen and walked restlessly about. But as she finished speaking, she turned and faced her companion squarely. Nellie Pennington rose and took her again in her arms. "You'll do, Jane. I'm not afraid for you, for either of you. Let me help you. I want to. I don't think I could be happier if I were in love myself. He's worthy of you. I'm sure of it. Shall you marry him soon, dear?" Jane colored adorably. "No, not soon, I think. We have not spoken of that. Phil wants time to prove, to show everybody." She paused and Nellie Pennington breathed a sigh of relief. Her responsibilities had oppressed her. "Let him, Jane," she urged quickly. "It's better so. You're very young. There's plenty of time. A year or two and then—" "I'll marry him when he asks me to," Jane finished simply. Nellie Pennington pressed her hands warmly, and they sat for a long time side by side while Jane told of all that had happened in the woods, including the sudden and unpleasant termination of her idyll. Nellie Pennington listened soberly and learned more of the definiteness with which fate had placed the steps of these two young people upon the same pathway into the future. Love dwelt in Jane's eyes and confidence, a trust and belief in Phil Gallatin that put Nellie Pennington's rather assertive endorsement of him to the blush. She realized now that below Jane Loring's placid exterior there was a depth of feeling, a quiet strength and resolution of which she had never even dreamed. For she, too, had thought Jane a nice little thing, a pretty, amiable, cheerful soul without prejudices, who would add much to her own joy of life and to the intimate circle of young people she chose to gather around her. Some of the girl's faith found its way into her own heart, and she saw Phil now as she had always hoped to see him, taking his place among the workers of the world, using the brains God had given him, and accomplishing the great things that she knew had always been within his power to accomplish. When Jane rose to go, Mrs. Pennington detained her a moment longer. "How well do you know Nina Jaffray?" she asked slowly. "Oh, we've always got along admirably, because we've never interfered with each other, I think. But I don't understand her, nor does she me. Why do you ask?" "Oh, I don't know. I thought you liked her, Nellie." "I do. I like everybody who doesn't bore me. Nina amuses me because she keeps me in a continual state of surprise. That's all very well so long as her surprises are pleasant ones, but when she wishes to be annoying, I assure you she can be amazingly disagreeable." "I imagine so, but I don't think we'll have differences. At least I hope. Don't be too intimate. That's all. Understand?" They kissed, after which Jane departed, and on the way uptown found herself wondering from time to time whether Nellie Pennington could have meant something more than Jane thought she did. But in her state of exaltation nothing could long avail to divert her spirit from its joyous flight among the enchanted realms that had been discovered to her. That afternoon, late, it was only going to be very late in the afternoon, she now remembered, Phil Gallatin was to walk home with her from somebody's tea. Tomorrow they were to dine at the Dorsey Martins, and late in the week there was the party at the Pot and Kettle. After that, but what did it matter what happened after that? Each day, she knew, was to be more wonderful than the one that had gone before, and it was not well to question the future too insistently. Sufficient unto the day was the good thereof, and Solomon indeed was not arrayed, inwardly at least, as Jane was. Taking Mrs. Pennington's advice, as soon as she reached home, she sought her mother's room. Mrs. Loring was reclining at full length on a portable wooden table which had been set up in the middle of her large apartment, and an osteopath was busy manipulating her small body. There wasn't really anything the matter with her except social fag, but she chose this method of rehabilitating her tired nerves instead of active exercise, which she abhorred. It was almost with a feeling of pity that Jane sat beside her mother when the practitioner had departed, for she knew that a scene would follow her confidences, and she was not mistaken. For when half an hour later Jane went to her own room, her mother was in a state of collapse upon her bed, and Jane's nerves were singing like taut wires, while on her mind were unpleasantly impressed the final words of maternal recrimination. But Jane knew that in spite of the violence of her mother's opposition, she was very much less to be dreaded than her father, and that by tomorrow she would be reconciled to her daughter's point of view and even might be reckoned upon as an ally. Nor would she speak to Mr. Loring without her daughter's acquiescence. This Jane had no intention of giving, for she was sure that a meeting of her father and Phil, which must of course ensue at once, was not to be looked forward to with pleasurable expectation. It was therefore in no very happy mood that Jane met Phil Gallatin late that afternoon at the Suydams' tea, whence he went home with her. She had said nothing of her interview with her mother, and was relieved to learn at the house that Mrs. Loring had gone out. She led Phil back into the library and they sat before the open fire. "What is it, Jane?" he asked. "Are you regretting?" "No," she smiled. "There isn't room in my heart for regret. It's full of other things." "I'm very dense. Can you prove it?" "I'll try." The davenport was huge, but only one end of it complained of their weight. "Phil, are you sure there is no mistake?" "Positive." "And you never cared for anyone else?" "Never." "Not Nina Jaffray?" "No. Why do you ask?" "She once told me you had a boy and girl affair." "Oh, that. She used to tease me and I would wash her face in the snow. That's Nina's idea of mutual affection." "It isn't her idea now, is it?" "I'm sure I don't know. You'll have to ask Larry Kane." "And you don't ever think about her?" "No, except with vague alarm for the safety of the species." Jane laughed. "I don't want you to be unkind," she said, but was not displeased. There was a silence in which Gallatin peered around the great room, and his eyes smiled as they sought her face again. "What are you thinking of?" she asked. "Of this shelter and another up among the pine trees. Oh, how white and cold it must be there now. It's ours, though, Phil. So personal." "I'll build another here in New York." "Not like this." "No, hardly," he smiled. "I'm glad of that. This house oppresses me. It's so big, so silent, and yet so noisy with the money that has been spent on it. I don't like money, Phil." "That's because you've never felt the need of it. I'm glad you don't, though. You know, I'm not very well off." "I don't suppose Daddy would ever let me starve," she laughed. His expression changed and he chose his words deliberately, his face turned toward the fire. "It isn't my intention to place you in any such position," he said with curious precision. "I don't think you understand. It isn't possible for me to accept anything from your father." "Except yourself, Jane. I'll take you empty-handed as I first found you, or not at all. But even then you know it was my saucepan." But he shook his head. "It isn't a question of saucepans now." "You're not fair, Phil," she murmured soberly. "Is it my fault that father has become what he is? Why shouldn't I help? I have something of my own, some stock in—" He closed her lips with a kiss. "I've got to have my own way. Can't you understand?" he whispered earnestly. "It's my sanity I'm fighting for, sanity of body and mind, and the medicines are toil, drudgery, responsibility. I've never known what work really meant. One doesn't learn that sort of thing in the crowd I've been brought up with. It's only the money a fellow makes himself that does him any good. I've seen other fellows raised as I was, losing their hold on life, slipping into the quagmire. I always thought I could pull up when I liked, when I got ready, but when I tried, I found I couldn't." He paused and Jane pressed his hand in both of hers, but he went on decisively. "Desperate illnesses need desperate remedies, Jane. I learned that up there with you. I've been ill, but I've found the cure and I'm taking it already. Downtown I've cut myself off from all financial support. I shan't have a dollar that I cannot make. I'm driven to the wall and I'm going to fight." He paused and then turned and looked into her eyes. "That's why it is that I want you to come to me empty-handed. I want to remember every hour of the day that on my efforts alone your happiness depends, your peace of mind, your future." "Yes, I understand. But it might be made easier."
"There isn't any easy way. And whatever my other sins, I wouldn't climb to fortune on a woman's shoulders. I've nothing to offer you but my love."
"It's enough."
"No, I came into your life a pauper, a derelict, an idler,
"Don't, Phil," she whispered, her fingers on his lips.
I shall come to you sane and whole, or I shall not come to you. I ask nothing of you. You must make me no promises."
"I don't see how you can prevent that," she smiled. "I shall make them anyway."
"No, you're not promised to me."
"I am."
"No."
"I don't see how you can prevent my promising. I promise to love, honor and obey."
"Then obey at once and stop promising."
"I won't."
"Then what validity has a promise, broken the moment it's made?"
His logic was inevitable. "Cherish, then," she evaded. He held her away from him, looked into her eyes and laughed.
"If it establishes no precedent, you may cherish me at once."
"What does cherish mean?"
He showed her.
"I'm afraid the precedent is already established, Phil." She sighed. She sank back in his arms and he kissed her tenderly. "I can't stop seeing you, Jane," he whispered at her ear. "You renew me, give me new faith in myself, new hope for the future. I know that I oughtn't to have the right, but I can't give you up. I need you. When I'm with you, I wonder how there could ever be any sin in the world. Your eyes are so clear, dear, like the pool, our pool in the woods, and my image in them is as clear as they are. Whatever I've said, I don't want that image to go out of them. Keep it there, Jane, no matter what happens, and believe in me." "I will," she whispered. "Whatever happens, I'll come for you some day, dear. Soon, perhaps. I'm working on a big case, one that involves large issues. All of me that isn't yours, I'm giving to that. And that's yours, too." "You'll win, Phil." "Yes, I'll win. I must win," he finished. "I must." "Oh, Phil, dear," she murmured. "It doesn't matter. What should I care whether you win or lose? Whatever you have been, whatever you are or hope to be, you've kissed me and I'm yours until the end. What does it matter what I promise or what I fail to promise? I'll wait for you because you wish it. But I would tell the world tomorrow if you'd let me."
"No," he said quickly. "Not yet. I want to look my enemy in the eyes, Jane. For a long while. I'll stare him down until he slinks away, not into the shadows behind me, but away, far off, so far that he shall not find me again, or I him, ever."
"Is the enemy here now?" she questioned anxiously.
"No," he smiled, "not here. I drove away from him in an enchanted brougham."
Jane straightened and looked into the fire. "Phil?"
"Yes."
"I've told Nellie Pennington and Mother. He folded his arms and gazed steadily into the fire. "What did they say?" "Nellie Pennington was pleased. Mother was not," she said frankly. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I could hardly have expected " "It doesn't matter," she went on hastily. "I thought you ought to know." "I shall see Mr. Loring," he said, his brows tangling. "Is it necessary at once?" "I think so. There mustn't be any false positions. I hope I can make him understand. Obviously I can't visit the house of a man who doesn't want me there." Jane couldn't reply at once, and when she did her face was as serious as his own. "Won't you leave that to me, Phil?" she said gently. Chapter 17 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Pot and Kettle. The Pot and Kettle was up in the hills near Tuxedo, within motoring distance of the city and near enough to a station to be convenient to those who were forced to depend upon the railroad. It was a gabled farmhouse of an early period converted by the young men of Colonel Broadhurst's generation into its latter-day uses as a club for dilettante cooks, where the elect might come in small parties on snowy winter nights or balmy summer ones and concoct with their own hands the glasses and dishes most to their liking. Its membership was limited and its fellows clannish. Most of the younger members of the club had been proposed on the day of their birth, and accession at the age of 21 to its rights and privileges had always been the signal for a celebration with an intent both gastronomic and bibulous. On club nights everyone contributed his share to the evening's entertainment, and the right to mix cocktails, make the salad dressing, or grill the bird was transmitted by solemn act in writing from those of the older generation to those of the new, who could not be dispossessed of their respective offices without a proper delegation of authority or the unanimous vote of those present. A member of the Pot and Kettle had the privilege of giving private entertainments to a select few, provided due notice was given in advance, and upon that occasion the club was his own, and all other members were warned to keep off the premises. This gave the Pot and Kettle affairs a privacy like that which the member enjoyed in his own home, for it was the unwritten law of the club that whatever passed within its doors was not to be spoken of elsewhere. Egerton Savage had long ago discovered that no preparation was necessary to make entertainment successful at the Pot and Kettle. The number of a party given to the steward and his wife. All a host had to do was to put on his white apron and await the arrival of his guests. But to give an added zest to this occasion, the fortunate ones had been advised that the party was for children only. And as children they came. Ogden Spencer, Larry Kane, and Coley Van Duyn, in a motor direct from the Cosmos Club, arrived first and hurried upstairs with their packages from the costumers to dress. The Perrins and Betty Tremaine followed, then Mrs. Pennington, the chaperone, and a limousine full of debutantes. Jane Loring with Honora Ledyard and Bibby Worthington, and Derwell Delancey with Clifford Benson, and Freddie Sackett. Nina Jaffray had driven out alone. Most of the girls had dressed at home and arrived ready for the fray, and after a few finishing touches in the ladies' dressing room upstairs were ready to greet their host at the foot of the stairs. Egerton Savage, his thin legs emerging from velvet knee breeches as Little Boy Blue, met Little Miss Muffet, Old King Cole, Old Mother Hubbard, Peter Piper, Marjorie Daw, Bobby Shafto, Jack Spratt, Solomon Grundy, and all of the rest of the nursery crew. Nellie Pennington's debutantes scattered about the building like a pack of inquisitive terriers, investigating every nook and cranny, peering into cupboards and closets and punctuating the clatter of arrival with pleasant little yelps of delight. As they all assembled at last in the kitchen, large white aprons which covered their costumes from neck to foot were handed out, and the real business of the evening was begun. Egerton Savage, chief cook and arbiter, with a shrewd knowledge of the capabilities of debutantes, handed each of the young ladies a loaf of bread and a long toasting fork, their mission being to provide the toast as well as the toasts of the night. And presently an odor of scorching bread pervaded the place. Jane rebelled. "I simply won't be subjected to such an indignity, Mr. Savage," she laughed. "I can cook, really I can." He eyed her askant and laughed. "You must be Mistress Mary quite contrary, aren't you?" "I am, and I won't cook toast." At last he commissioned her to poach the eggs. Larry Kane, a club member, as the infant Bacchus, in fleshlings and cheesecloth, with a garland of grape leaves on his head, had already begun the concoction known as the pot and kettle punch, an amber-colored fluid with a fragrant odor of spices and a taste that was mildness itself, but in which there lurked the potent spell of the wassail of many lands. It was against this punch that Nellie Pennington had taken pains on the way out in the machine to warn her small brood, and some of those young ladies who had already retired from the fire stood beside the mixer of ingredients, sniffing at the uncorked bottles, making pretty faces and lisping in childish disapproval. Coleman Van Duyn as little Jack Horner, his scarlet face rising like a winter sunset from his white apron, was superintending the broiling of the lobsters. Durwell Delancey, who proclaimed himself Simple Simon, was carving cold turkey. Freddie Sackett was making the salad dressing, while Betty Tremaine, a very comely Bo Peep, was drying the lettuce leaves and crushing them to the proper consistency between her slender pink fingers. Yates Rowland stewed the terrapin. Percy Endicott made the coffee, and Sam Purviance, with Nina Jaffray's help, made the cocktails. The festivities of supper were well under way before Phil Gallatin arrived. It had been late before he could leave the office, and so he had been obliged to come out by train. After getting into costume, he sought the room eagerly for Jane, and their eyes met in wireless telegraphy across the table. The chairs beside her were occupied by Worthington and Van Duyn, so he dropped into a chair Savage offered him between Mrs. Pennington and Miss Tremaine. His host thrust a cocktail in front of him on the table, and Phil thanked him over his shoulder, but when Savage had gone, he pushed it away. Nellie Pennington realized that he looked a little tired and serious, but made no comment. Gallatin had been working hard all day, and until the present moment had forgotten that he had had no lunch. Food revived him, and it was not long before he could enter into the gay spirit of the company. They were children indeed. The cooking finished, their white aprons had been discarded, and loud was the joy at the appearance of the men and eager the compliments for the ladies. the babble of baby rattles and tin whistles, discontinued for a time, arose again, and the table rang from end to end with joke and laughter. Bibby Worthington's wig of Bobby Shafto got askew, and at an unfortunate moment was jostled off into the salad bowl, upon which his bald head received baptism in fizz at the hands of the infant Bacchus. Freddie Perrin, who had had more than his share of punch, was shooting butter balls from the prongs of a fork at Kent Baylard's white shirt front, for Baylard hadn't had time to go to the costumer. Derwell Delancey insisted upon singing "The Low-Backed Car," but was prevented from doing so by the vehemence of his chorus, which advised him to get a limousine. Sam Purviance began telling a story which seemed to be leading toward Montmartre, when Nellie Pennington rose from the table and, followed by her buds, adjourned to another room. Here the sound of a piano was immediately heard, and the tireless feet of the younger set took up the turkey trot which they had left off at 3 o'clock the night before. No word had passed between Phil Gallatin and Jane, and he had just gotten to his feet in pursuit of her when Nina Jaffray stood in his way. "Hello, Phil," she said. "I've been wanting to see you." "Me? I'm glad of that, Nina. You're certainly a corker in that get-up. What are you?" "I'm Jill. Won't you help me fetch a pail of water?" "And have my crown broken? No, thanks. Besides, I couldn't. It wouldn't be in the part. You see, I'm Tommy Trot, the man of law, who sold his bed to lay on straw." "Are you? It isn't true, is it, Phil? I heard you were going out of the firm." "Oh, no. I've been working, Nina. Sounds queer, doesn't it? Fact, though." "There's something I want to see you about, Phil. I've been on the point of looking you up at the office." "You? What is it?" he laughed. "Breach of promise or alienation of the affections?" "Neither." Slowly. "Seriously, there's something I want to say to you." Gallatin looked at her and she met his eye fairly. "I'd like to talk to you here now, if you don't mind." "Oh, of course. But if it's anything of a serious nature, perhaps—" "I can speak here. Will you follow me?" Gallatin glanced over his shoulder in the direction of the room into which Jane had disappeared. But there was nothing left but to follow, so he helped the girl find a quiet spot on the back stairway, where Nina settled herself and motioned to him to a place at her feet. Gallatin sat trying to conceal his impatience in the smoke of a cigarette, and wondering how soon Nina would let him go to Jane. "Phil, you and I have known each other a good many years. We've always got along pretty well, haven't we?" "Of course," he nodded. "You've never cared much for girls, and I've never thought much about men. Sentimentally, I mean. But we always understood each other and, well, we're pretty good friends, aren't we?" "I'd be very sorry if I thought anything else," he said politely. She paused and examined his profile steadily. "You know, Phil, I'm interested in you. I think I've always been interested. But I never told you so because it seemed unnecessary. I thought if you ever needed my friendship, you'd come and ask me for it." "I would. I do," he stammered. "Something has been bothering me," she went on slowly. "The other morning at Nellie Pennington's, Jane Loring told us the truth about the Dryad story." "Yes." "And, of course, even though friendship doesn't give me the privilege of your confidence, unless you offer it voluntarily, I thought you might be willing to tell me something." "What, Nina?" You're not in love with you're not going to marry Jane Loring, are you?" Gallatin smiled. "I'm hardly the sort of person any girl could afford to marry," he said slowly. "Does Jane Loring think so?" she persisted. "She has every reason to think so," he muttered. "You're not engaged?" she protested quickly. "No," he said promptly. She gave a sigh of relief. "Oh, that's all I wanted to know." Something unfamiliar in the tones of her voice caused him to look at his companion. "What did you want to know for, Nina?" he questioned. "Because if you were engaged, if you really were in love with Jane, I wouldn't care. I wouldn't have the right to speak to you in confidence." She hesitated, looking straight at the bare wall before her, but she smiled her devil-may-care smile and went on with a touch of her old manner. "I doubt if you really know me very well after all. I don't think anybody does. I've got a name for playing the game wide open and riding roughshod over all the dearest conventions of the dodos. But I'm straight as a string, Phil, and there isn't a man or woman in the Cedarcroft or out that can deny it." Gallatin smiled. "It wouldn't be healthy for anybody to deny it." "I don't care much whether they deny it or not. People who don't like my creed are welcome to their own. I won't bother them and they needn't bother me. But I do care for my friends and I'm true. You know that, don't you?" "Of course." "And I'm not all hoyden, Phil." "Who said you were?" "Nobody, but people think it." "I don't." "I was hoping you'd say that. Inside of me I think I'm quite womanly at times." He smiled and looked at her curiously. "But I'm tired of riding through life on a loose snaffle. I want to settle down and have a place of my own and all that." "I hadn't an idea. Is that what you wanted to tell me? Who is it, Nina?" "I'm not in love, you know, Phil," she went on. "I've watched the married couples in our set, those who made love matches, or thought they did, those who married for money or convenience, and those who just married. There's not a great deal of difference in the result. One kind of marriage is just about as successful or as unsuccessful as another. It's time I married, and I've tried to think the thing out in my own way. I've about decided that the successful marriage is entirely a matter of good management, a thing to be carefully planned from the very beginning." Gallatin listened with dull ears. The girl beside him was talking heresies. Happiness wasn't to be built on such a scientific formula. Love was born in Arcadia. He knew. And Jane. "You know, Phil," he heard Nina Jaffray saying again, "I'm in the habit of speaking plainly. You may not like my frankness, but you can be pretty sure that I mean what I say. I've made up my mind to marry, and I wanted you to know about it so that you could think it over." "Me? Nina!" Gallatin started forward suddenly, aware of the personal note in her remarks. "You don't mean that I thought that you might like to marry me," she repeated coolly. "You can't mean it," he gasped. "That I mean nothing else. I'd like to marry you, Phil." Gallatin laughed. "Really, Nina, I was almost on the point of taking you seriously. You and I married. Wouldn't we have a lark, though?" "I'm quite serious," she insisted. "I'd like to marry you, if you haven't any other plans." "Plans?" He searched her eyes again. "Why, Nina, you silly child, you've never even flirted with me, at least not for years." "That's true. I couldn't somehow. I couldn't flirt with anybody I cared for." "Then you do care for me," he muttered in bewilderment. "Don't mistake me, Phil," she put in. "I care for you, yes, but I'm not in the least sentimental. I abhor sentimentality. You're simply the nearest approach I have found to my idea of masculine completeness. You're not an ideal person by any means. Your vices are quite brutal, but they don't terrify me. And you're pretty well endowed with compensating virtues. It's about time you gathered in your loose reins and took to the turnpike. I'd like to help you, and I think I could."
I haven't any doubt of it," he stammered. "Only "
"What?"
"I'm not a marrying man, that's all."
He blundered on, still struggling with incomprehension. She remained silent a moment. "You say that because you believe you oughtn't to marry, don't you, Phil?"
"I say it because I'm not going to marry until I know just where I stand, just what I'm worth in a long game. Single, I haven't hurt anybody but myself, but I'm not going to let any woman." He stopped suddenly and then with an abrupt gesture rose. "I can't talk of this, Nina," he said quickly. "You must see it's impossible. You're not in love with me or likely to be."
"Oh, I'm in no hurry. I might learn," she said calmly. There was no refuge from her quiet insistence but in laughter, and so brutally he took it.
"Really, Nina, if I hadn't known you all my life, I could almost believe you serious."
"Don't laugh. I am," she said immovably. And now that it seemed to Gallatin there remained no doubt that she meant it, he sat down again beside her and took her hand in his face set in serious lines. He liked Nina, but like so many other persons had always weighed her lightly. Even now he felt sure that by tomorrow she would probably have forgotten the entire conversation. But the situation was one that required a complete understanding.
"If I can believe you, you've succeeded in flattering me a great deal. I've always been used to expect amazing things of you, but I can't say I'm quite prepared for the extraordinary point of view on married life which you ask me to share. I've always had another idea of marriage, the same one that you have deep down in your heart, for without it you wouldn't be a woman. You'll marry the man you love and no other."
"And if the man I love won't marry me?"
"It will be time to settle that when you meet him."
"I've already met him." Gallatin searched her eyes for the truth and was again surprised when he found it in them. Her gaze fell before his and she turned her head away, as though the look he had seen in her eyes had shamed her.
"It isn't true, Nina. It can't be."
"Yes," she murmured. "It's quite true. I think I've pitied you a little, but I'm quite sure that I've cared for you always." There was a silence and then she heard,
"God knows I'm sorry."
There was a note of finality in his tone which affected her strangely. It was not until then that she guessed the truth. You care for Jane Loring?"
"Yes,"
he said almost inaudibly.
"I do."
He owed her that frankness. "Thanks," she said quietly. "It's strange. I shouldn't have guessed. I didn't think you cared for anyone. You never have, you know. And it never entered my head that you could be really interested in a girl like Jane. Even when I learned that you had been together in the woods, I couldn't believe. I don't think I quite believe it yet. She's hardly your style." She stopped and he remained silent, his head averted. "Funny, isn't it?" she went on. "Larry Kane wants to marry me. I want to marry you. And you want to marry Jane. Now, if Jane would only fall in love with Larry." She laughed and drew away from him, for over his head she saw the figures of Jane Loring and Coleman Van Duyn, who had just entered the kitchen. Jane had glanced just once in their direction and then had turned aside. Nina glanced at Phil. He was unconscious of the presence of the others. It almost seemed unconscious of herself. All the mischief in her bubbled suddenly to the surface. Jane Loring, at least, should see. "I'm sorry, Phil," she murmured. "I think I'll survive. We can still be friends. I want one favor of you, though," he questioned. "Kiss me, will you, Phil?" she whispered. And Gallatin did, to turn in a moment and see Jane Loring's skirts go fluttering past the dining room door, through which, grinning broadly over his shoulder, Coleman Van Duyn quickly followed her. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Enemy and a Friend. It was a moment before Gallatin realized the full significance of the incident. But when he turned to look at Nina, he found her leaning against the wall, convulsed with silent laughter. "You knew, Nina," he said, struggling for his self-control. "You saw them there?" "Oh, yes, I saw them," she replied easily. "I couldn't help it very well." "You asked me to kiss you," he stammered, his color rising. "Yes, I did. You never had kissed me before, you know, Phil." You wanted her to see," he asserted. "I didn't mind her seeing, if that's what you mean." "You had no right." She held up her hand with a mock gesture of command. "Don't speak. You'll say something you'll regret. It's not often I ask a man to kiss me, and when I do I expect a display of softer emotions. But anger, dismay, I'm surprised at you. You're really quite too rustic. Or is it rusty? Besides, you know, I've done you the greatest of favors." "Favors!" he exclaimed. "Precisely. In addition to accepting your fraternal benediction, I've succeeded in creating a diversion in the ranks of the dear enemy. Jealousy is the vinegar of the salad of love, Phil. Jane is quite sure to love you madly now." "Come," he said briefly. "Let's get out of this." "You mustn't use that tone to me. It's extremely annoying." "You're mischievous," he growled. "Am I?" with derisive sweetness. "I hadn't meant to be. Perhaps my infatuation has blinded me. I'm really very badly in love with you, Phil, and you must see that it's extremely unpleasant for me to discover that you're in love with somebody else. You know, I can't yield placidly. I'm not the placid kind. I may be in advance of my generation, but I'm sure if I had my way I'd abduct you tonight in the motor and fly to Hoboken." Gallatin laughed. He couldn't help it. She was too absurd, and her mocking effrontery made it difficult for him to remember that a moment ago he had thought her serious. "Fortunately, I am capable of moderating my emotions," she went on. "My heart may be beating wildly, but behold me quietly submissive to your decision. All I ask is that you won't offer to be a brother to me, Phil. I really couldn't stand for that." "Nina, you're the limit." "I know I am. I'm excited. It's the outward and visible expression of inward and spiritual dissolution. What would you advise? Paris Green or a leap from the Metropolitan Tower? One exit is plebeian, the other squashy. Or I had better blow out the gas? Will you see that my headlines are not too sentimental? Not 'She died for love.' Something like 'Scorned, social success suicides,' or 'Her last cropper.' More in my line. Sorrowfully alliterative, if you like, but chastely simple. Aren't you sorry for me, Phil?" "Hardly. As the presentment of disappointed affection, you're not a success. Your martyrdom has all the aspects of a frolic at my expense. Don't you think you've made a fool of me long enough?" "Yes, I think so. I have made a fool of you, haven't I? I'm sorry. I didn't intend to until I found that you had made a fool of me. I wanted company." Her humor changed as he turned away from her and she restrained him with a hand on his arm, her eyes seeking his. "You're my sort, Phil, not hers," she whispered earnestly. "You're a vagabond, a vagrant on life's highway, as I am, a failure as I am, only a worse one. You've tried to stem the tide against you, but you couldn't. What have you to do with Jane Loring's bourgeois respectability? Do you think you'll be immune because of her? Do you think that she can cleanse you of the blood of your fathers and make you over on her own prim pattern? You're run in a different mold. What Jane Loring wants is a stupid, respectable dodo, an impoverished patriarch with an exclusive visiting list. Let her buy one in the open market. The clubs are full of them." She laughed aloud. "What does Jane Loring know of you? What chance have you?" "I think I've heard enough, Nina," said Gallatin. He walked to the dining room and stood waiting for her to pass before him. She paused, shrugged her shoulders carelessly, and as she passed through the door she leaned toward him and whispered, "You'll never marry her, Phil. Do you hear? Never." Gallatin inclined his head slightly and followed. The dance was in full swing, and outside in the enclosed veranda a game of Pussy Wants a Corner had come to an end because Sam Purviance insisted upon standing in the middle of the floor and reciting tearfully the tale of Old Mother Hubbard and her dog. Then they tried charades, which failed because the actors insisted on disappearing into the wings and couldn't be made to appear, and because the audience found personal problems more interesting. A game of Follow My Leader, led by Larry Kane upstairs and down, developed such amazing feats of gymnastics that Nellie Pennington rebelled. Phil Gallatin followed Jane with his eyes, but she refused even to glance in his direction, and he was very unhappy. There seemed no chance of getting a word with her, for when at the end of the dance he approached her, she snubbed him very prettily and went out with Van Duyn to sit among the palms at the end of the veranda. Gallatin felt very much like the fool Nina had said he was, and wandered around from group to group, joining half-heartedly in their conversations, his uneasiness apparent to any who chose to perceive. Several times Nina Jaffray passed him, smiling wickedly, and once she stopped and whispered, "Hadn't you better come home in my car, Phil? I don't believe there will be room for you in Jane's." He laughed with an air of unconcern he was very far from feeling. "Thanks. I'm afraid you'll take me to Hoboken." She went on to the dance and Gallatin watched her until she disappeared. He was alone in the dining room. Through the door by which she had gone came the sound of the piano and the chatter of gay voices. Through the other door he could see a jovial group of his familiars sitting around a table, in the center of which was a tall bottle bearing a familiar label. His enemy, enthroned as usual in this company, he was like a vessel in the chop of two tides, one of which would bring him to a safe port and the other to sea. He looked away, hesitated, then walked hastily to the colonial sideboard where he drew a cup of hot coffee and drank it quickly. Then he followed Nina into the dancing room. He waited impatiently until the dance was finished, and then when Jane Loring was left for a moment alone, with more valor than discretion, went up to her. "Jane," he whispered, "you've got to give me a moment alone." She turned away, but he stood in front of her again. "It's all a mistake. If you'll let me explain." "Let me pass, please." "No, not until you promise to listen to me tonight. I'll go in your machine and then—" "I'm sorry. There's no room for you, Mr. Gallatin." "I must see you tonight." "No, not tonight," and in lowered tones, "or any other night." "Jane, Let me pass, please." The music began again, and Percy Endicott at this moment came up, claiming her for a partner. Before Gallatin could speak again, Jane was in Endicott's arms and laughing gaily was sweeping around the room to the measure of a two-step. Gallatin stared at her as though he had not been able to believe his own ears. He waited a moment and then slowly walked back toward the kitchen. His appearance in the doorway was the signal for a shout from Egerton Savage, who held a glass aloft and offered his health. His health! He swayed forward heavily. What did it matter? His blood surged. What would it matter? Just once. Just once. He lunged forward into the chair somebody pushed toward him, took up the glass of champagne his host had poured for him, drained it, his eyes closed, and put it down on the table. Just once. It was a beautiful wine, sent out for the occasion from Mr. Savage's own collection in town, and it raced through Gallatin's veins like quicksilver, tingling to his very finger ends. He looked up and laughed. Something had bothered him a moment ago. What was it? He had forgotten. Life was a riot of color and delight, and here were his friends, his men friends, who were always glad to see a fellow, no matter what. It was good to have that kind of friends. Somebody told a story. Gallatin had not heard the beginning of it, but he realized that he was laughing uproariously, more loudly than anyone else at the table. The lights swam in a mist of tobacco smoke, and the figures of the men around him were blurred. Egerton Savage had filled his glass again, and Gallatin was in the very act of reaching forward to take it when Bibby Worthington, who sat alongside, rose suddenly as though to get a match from the holder, and the sleeve of his laced coat somewhat obtrusively swept Gallatin's glass off the table to the stone flagging. "Beg pardon," he said cheerfully. "There's many a lip 'twixt the nip and the pip. Sorry, Phil." The crash of glass had startled Gallatin, who looked up into Worthington's face for a possible meaning of the incident, for it was the clumsiest accident that could befall a sober man. But Bibby, his lighted match suspended in midair, returned his gaze with one quite calm and unwavering. Gallatin understood, and a dark flush rose under his skin. He was about to speak when Bibby broke in. "Phil, I'm probably the most awkward person in the world," he said evenly. "The only thing about me that's ever in the right place is my heart. Understand?" If Gallatin had thought of replying, the words were unuttered, for he lowered his head and only muttered a word or two which could not be heard. Bibby blew the strands of his tousled wig from his eyes and carefully brushed the liquor from his sleeve with his lace handkerchief. "Sad thing that," he said gravely. "Vintage, too." "Lucky there's more of it," said Savage, taking up the bottle. "Hand me one of those glasses on the side table there, Bibby." Worthington turned slowly away, looked down at Gallatin, and a glance passed between the two men. As Bibby moved off, Gallatin took out his case and hastily lit a cigarette. "Never mind, Bibby," he found himself saying. "No thanks, Egerton. I'm on the wagon." He lit his cigarette, rose, opened the door, and looked out into the winter night, drinking in deep draughts of the keen air. His evil moment had passed. "Howling success, this party, Egerton," somebody was saying. "Listen to those infants on the veranda." "Hello!" cried Bibby. "It's Bobby Shafto! By George, I'll have to go in and make my bow. Come along, Phil. They'll be calling for you presently. What the devil are you, anyway?" Phil Gallatin took his arm and walked out on the terrace. I'm a fool, Bibby. Pretty poorly masked," he muttered heavily. "You are, my boy, but it takes a wise man to admit he is a fool. Glad you know it. Awfully glad. Not sore, are you?" "No," said Gallatin slowly. "Not in the least. Nothing like the crash of glass to awake a fellow. Feel all right?" "Yes, I think so." "I had a lot of nerve to do a thing like that, Phil. But you see, I'm glad you did. I won't forget it, Bibby." The two men clasped hands in the darkness in a new bond of friendship. They entered the house from another door and passed through the closed veranda. Upon the floor of the living room, in a large circle facing the center, the infants sat, tailor fashion, singing lustily, and greeted Bobby Shafto's appearance with shouts of glee. They made him get into their midst and dance, which he did with all the grace of a jackdaw, while Betty Tremaine played the accompaniment on the piano. "Bobby Shafto's gone to sea, silver buckles on his knee. He'll come back and marry me, darling Bobby Shafto." "But who is he going to marry?" maliciously chortled one of the debutantes in the ensuing pause. "You, my angel, if you'll have me." And leaning over, he quickly kissed her. There was a laugh at the girl's expense, and Bibby retired in triumph. One by one the characters were summoned and noisily greeted. Old King Cole, who was Yates Rowland, old Mother Hubbard, who was Percy Endicott. "Amply taken, by Jove," was Spencer's comment, and Simple Simon, who was Derwell Delancey, and looked the part. But the hit of the occasion was the dance which followed between Jill and the infant Bacchus. It was clear that no nursery music would be suitable here. So Betty Tremaine's fingers hurried into the presto of Anitra's dance from the Peer Gynt music, which caught the requirements of the occasion. The dancers were well matched, and the audience upon the floor, which had at first begun to clap its hands to the gay lilt, slowly drew back to give more room, and then finding itself in danger from the flying heels, dispersed and looked on from adjacent doorways. The dance was everything, and it was nothing. Redowa, tarantella, Cossack, fandango, and only ended when the dancers and pianist were exhausted. The party broke up amidst wild applause, and led by Mrs. Pennington, the guests were already on their way to the dressing rooms when Nina Jaffray, still breathless from her exertions, stepped before Gallatin and whispered amusedly, It almost seems as if you might go with me after all, doesn't it, Phil?" She laughed. "It's too late for a train, and all the machines but mine are crowded." "You're very kind, but I think I'll walk. It's only 20 miles." "Don't be disagreeable, Phil. Larry Kane wanted to go with me, but I've sent him along with Ogden Spencer, just because I wanted to apologize to you." "Apology," he laughed. "Why dwell on that? Besides, you're a little too prompt to be quite sincere." "Haven't you any sense of humor, Phil?" "No." "What a situation! You kiss me and I apologize for it. Laugh, Phil, laugh. Mrs. Grundy is shrieking with delight. Oh, boy, what a silly thing you look." "Good night, Nina." "No, au revoir," she corrected. "You know, Phil, you mustn't insult me, not publicly, that is. You see, you couldn't force yourself into somebody else's machine when I'm going home alone in an empty one. Besides, it's all arranged with Egerton." Gallatin smiled and shrugged. "Oh, of course," he said. "You seem to have me at your mercy." "I'll be very good, though, Phil," she said, moving toward the stairway. "And if you're afraid of me, I'll ask Egerton to be chaperone." She laughed at him over her shoulder, and he had to confess that this was the humor which suited her best. Gallatin went slowly toward his dressing room, his lips compressed, his head bent, a prey to a terrible depression made up of fervid self-condemnation. He had been on the very verge of that which he most dreaded. In his heart, too, was a dull resentment at Jane's intolerance, an attitude he was forced to admit when he could think more clearly that he had now amply justified, not because Jane had been a witness of the incident upon the kitchen stairway, but because of the other thing. Slowly he began to realize that to a woman a kiss is a kiss, whether coolly implanted near the left ear, as his had been, or upon a more appropriate spot, and the distinction which at the time of the occurrence had been so clear to his mind seemed now to be less impressive. Jane's position was unreasonable, but quite tenable, and he now discovered that unless he threw Nina's confidences into the breach, a defense hardly possible under the circumstances, the matter would be difficult to explain. And yet the act had been so harmless, his intention so innocent, that, weighed in the balance with his love for Jane, the incident seemed to him the merest triviality, with reference to which Jane should not have condemned him unheard. He heard her laugh as she went down the stairs, and the carelessness of that mirth cut him to the marrow. What right had she to be gay when she knew that he must be suffering? He entered Nina's limousine very much sobered, with a wish somewhere hidden in his heart that for this night at least Nina had been in Jericho. If the lady in the machine divined his thought, she gave not the least sign of it, for when they had left the club, some time after the others, and were on their way to the city, she carelessly resumed. "I didn't ask Egerton to come, Phil. You're not really alarmed, are you?" "Not in the least," he smiled. "In fact, I was hoping we'd be alone." "Phil, you're improving. Why?" "So that we may continue our interesting conversation at the point where we left off." "Where did we leave off? Oh, yes, you kissed me, didn't you? Shall we begin there?" "I suppose that's what you asked me here for, isn't it?" he said brutally. "Oh, Phil, you don't believe that?" She deserved this punishment, she knew, but the carelessness of his tone shocked her and she moved away into her corner of the vehicle and sat rigidly as though turned to stone, her eyes gazing steadily before her at the white circle of light beyond the formless back of the chauffeur. In the reflected light Gallatin saw her face, and the jest that was on his lips was silenced before the look he found there. And when she spoke, her voice was low and constrained. "I'm sorry you said that." "Are you? You weren't sorry earlier in the evening." "I'm sorry now." "It's a little late to be sorry." She didn't reply. She was looking out into the light again with peering eyes. Objects in the landscape emerged, shadowless, in pale outline, brightened and disappeared. "It isn't like you, not in the least like you," she murmured. "You've rather upset me, Phil." "What did you expect?" he asked. "You've made a fool of me. You've been flirting with me abominably." "And you repay me." "In your own coin," he put in. "Don't, Phil." She covered her face with her hands a moment. "You've paid me well. Oh, that you could have said that." "I meant what I said, Phil, back there. You've got to believe it now. You've shamed me so. You've got to know it, to believe it. I wasn't flirting with you. I was serious with you when I said I loved you. It's the truth, the ghastly truth, and you've got to believe it, whatever happens. No, don't touch me. I don't want you to think I'm that kind of a girl. I'm not. I've never been kissed before tonight. Believe it or not, it's true. And now." She stopped and clutched him by the arm. "Tell me you believe it, Phil," she said almost fiercely. That I'm not that kind of a girl." "Of course. You've said so." "No, not because I've said so, but because you think enough of me to believe it, whether I've said so or not." "I had never thought you that sort of a girl," he said slowly. "I've known you to flirt with other fellows, but I didn't think you really cared enough about men to bother, least of all about me. That's why I was a little surprised." "I couldn't flirt with you. I didn't feel that way. I don't know why. I think because there was a dignity in our friendship." She stopped again with a sharp sigh. "Oh, what's the use? I'm not like other girls. That's all. I can't make you understand." "I hope I understand." "I'm sorry, Phil, about what happened tonight." She stopped, leaned back in her corner and with one of her curious transitions began laughing softly. "It was such a wonderful opportunity and you were so blissfully ignorant. Oh, Phil, and you did look such a fool." "Oh, did I?" "I'm sorry, but I'd probably do it again if I might tomorrow. Jane Loring is so prim, so self-satisfied." The motor had been moving more slowly and the man in front, after testing various mechanisms, brought the machine to a stop and climbed out. They heard him tinkering here and there, and after a moment he opened the door and announced, "Sorry, Miss Jaffray, but there's come a leak in the tank and we've run out of gasoline." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Love on Crutches. Mrs. Pennington's philosophy had taught her that it was better to be surprised than to be bored, and that even unpleasant surprises were slightly more desirable than no surprises at all. It was toward the end of January, on her halting journey homeward from Aiken one morning in Washington that she saw in a local journal the announcement of an engagement between Miss Jane Loring and Mr. Coleman Van Duyn. To say that she was surprised puts the matter mildly, and it is doubtful whether the flight of her ennui compensated her for the sudden pang of dismay which came with the reading of this article. She had left New York the day after the affair at the Pot and Kettle, and so had only the memory of Jane's confidences and Phil Gallatin's happy face to controvert the news. And when some days later she arrived in New York, she found that though unconfirmed in authoritative quarters, the rumors still persisted among her own friends and Jane's. Of Phil Gallatin she saw nothing, and learned that he was out of town on an important legal matter and would not return for a week. When she called on the Lorings, Jane showed a disposition to avoid personal topics, and at the mention of Philip Gallatin's name skillfully turned the conversation into other channels. To a woman of Mrs. Pennington's experience, the hint was enough, and she departed from the Loring mausoleum aware that something serious had happened which threatened Phil Gallatin's happiness. But in spite of the warmth of Jane's greeting and the careless way in which she had discussed the gossip of the hour, Nellie Pennington was not deceived, and by the time she was in her own brougham had made one of those rapid deductions for which she was famous. Jane looked jaded. Therefore she was unhappy. Therefore she still loved Phil Gallatin. Phil Gallatin was working hard. Therefore Phil was keeping straight. There must be some other cause for Jane's defection. What? Obviously a woman. Who? Nina Jaffray. Having reached this triumphant conclusion, Mrs. Pennington set about proving her several premises without the waste of a single moment of time. To this end, she sought out Percy Endicott, who, as she knew, was better informed upon most people's affairs than they were themselves, and from him learned the truth. Philip Gallatin had been discovered with Nina Jaffray in his arms on the kitchen stairs at the Pot and Kettle. Percy Endicott's talent for the ornamentation of bare narrative was well known, and before he had finished the story he had convinced himself, if not his listener, that this happy event had brought to a culmination a romance of many years' standing, and that Nina and Phil would soon be directing their steps with all speed to church. Mrs. Pennington laughed, not because what Percy told amused her, but because this narrative showed her that however much she was still lacking in reliable details, her earliest deductions had been correct. She would not believe the story until it had been confirmed by Bibby Worthington, to whom Coleman Van Duyn had related it as an eyewitness, and then herself supplied the grain of salt to make it palatable. The grain of salt was her knowledge of Nina Jaffray's extraordinary personality, which must account for any differences she discovered between the Phil Gallatin who kissed upon the back stairs and the Phil Gallatin with whom she was familiar. Whatever his deficiencies in other respects, he had never been considered as available timber by the gay young married women of Mrs. Pennington's own set, who had given him up in the susceptive sense as a hopeless case. If Phil had been addicted to the habit of promiscuous kissing, he had gone about the pursuit with a stealth which belied the record of his unsentimental but somewhat tempestuous history. She found herself wondering not so much about what had happened to Phil as about how Nina had managed what had happened. Nina's remarkable confession a few days before Egerton Savage's party recurred to her mind, and Nina's clearly expressed intention to bring Phil to her chariot wheel seemed somehow to have an intimate bearing upon the present situation. And yet, even admitting Nina's direct methods of seeking results, she could not understand how a fellow as much in love with another girl as Phil was could have been made so ready a victim. Could it be? No, there was no talk of that. And if Phil had again been in trouble, Mrs. Pennington knew that the indefatigable Percy would have told her of it. She thought about the matter a while and finally gave it up, uncertain whether to be anxious or only amused. But as the week went by, she was given tangible evidence that whatever feelings Jane Loring cherished in her heart for Phil Gallatin, the wings of victory, for the present at least, were perched upon the banneret of Mr. Coleman Van Duyn. Jane rode, walked and danced with him, and within a few short weeks, from a state of ponderous misery, Coleman Van Duyn had revived and now bore the definite outlines of a well-fed and happy Cupid. The rumors of an engagement persisted, and Mrs. Pennington was not the only person forced against her judgment or inclination to believe that the old Van Duyn mansion would once more have a mistress. Dirwell De Lancey, whose tenderness in Jane's quarter had been remarked, went into retirement for a brief period and only emerged when resignation had conquered surprise. Colonel Crosby Broadhurst sat in his corner at the Cosmos and wondered, as other people did, what the devil Jane Loring could see in Coley. Bibby Worthington still hovered amiably in Jane's background and would not be dislodged. He had proposed in due form to Jane and had been refused, but the cheerful determination of his bearing and his taste in cravats advised all who chose to concern themselves that he was still undismayed. After Mrs. Pennington, who thought that she saw a light, perhaps the person most surprised at Jane's sudden attachment for Coleman Van Duyn was Mrs. Loring. She had listened with incredulity to Jane's first confession of her relations with Philip Gallatin and had waited with resignation a resumption of the conversation. But as the days passed and her daughter said nothing, she thought it time to take the matter into her own hands and told Jane of her intention to speak of it to her husband. "I'll save you the trouble, Mother," said Jane, kissing her gravely on the forehead. "There is nothing between Mr. Gallatin and myself." Mrs. Loring concealed her delight with difficulty. "Jane, dear, something has happened." "Nothing at all," said Jane. "I changed my mind, that's all." "Oh," said Mrs. Loring. This much imparted, Jane would say no more. The matter was dropped, and to Mrs. Loring it seemed that in so far as Jane was concerned, Mr. Gallatin had simply ceased to exist. But it was not without some difficulty that Jane convinced herself that this was the case. The day after the pot and kettle affair, Phil Gallatin wrote, phoned, wired and called. His note Jane consigned to the fire. His telephone was answered by Hastings. His wire followed his note, and to his visit she was out. This, she thought, should have concluded their relations. But the following morning brought another letter, a long one. She hesitated before deciding whether to open it or to return it. But at last she broke the seal and read it through, her lips compressed, her brows tangled angrily. It was a plea for forgiveness, and that was all. There were many regrets, many protestations of love, but not one word of explanation. He had even gone so far as to call the incident a trifle indeed, and to call her to account for an intolerance which he had the temerity to say was unworthy of the great love that he had given her. The impudence of him! What did he mean? Was the man mad, or was this the New York idea? She realized now that he was an animal that she had met in an unfamiliar habitat, and that perhaps the things to be expected of him here were those dictated by the inconsiderable ideals of the day. It dismayed her to think that after all, here in New York, she had only known him a little more than a week. His vision appeared and was banished, and his letter, torn again and again into small pieces, was consigned to the flames of her open fire. She made no reply. Another letter came on the morrow, was read like the other, but likewise destroyed. His persistence was amazing. Would he not take a hint and save her the unpleasant duty of sending his letters back to him unopened? Apparently not. And with the letters came baskets of flowers which, like those from Mr. Van Duyn, filled her room with pleasant odors. She was willing to believe now that a word of explanation, a clue to his extraordinary behavior, might have paved the way to reconciliation, and she found herself wondering in a material way what was becoming of him, and worrying in spite of herself as to his future, of which, as she had once fondly believed, she was the guardian. What was he doing with himself in the evenings? This thought sent blood rushing to her cheeks and hardened her heart against him. He was with Nina Jaffray, of course. In his last letter he had written that he must go away on business, and for 2 mornings no letter arrived. She missed these letters and was furious with herself that it was so. But the energy of her anger was conserved in the form of further favors for Coley Van Duyn, who radiated it in rapturous goodwill toward all the world. When the letters were resumed, she locked them in her desk unread, determining upon his return to town to make them into a package and send them back in bulk. Many times she unlocked her desk and scrutinized the envelopes, but it was always to thrust them into their drawer, which she shut and locked each time with quite unnecessary violence. Another matter which caused some inquietude was Nellie Pennington's return to town, for Mrs. Pennington was the only person besides Mr. Gallatin and her mother in actual possession of her secret, the only person besides Mr. Gallatin whom it was necessary to convince as to the definiteness of her recantation. At their first meeting, Jane had carried off the situation with a carelessness which she felt had rather overshot the mark. Her visitor had accepted the hints with a disconcerting readiness and composure, and Jane had a feeling, after Mrs. Pennington left the house, that her efforts had been singularly ineffective, for she was conscious that her visitor had scrutinized her keenly, and that anything she had said had been carefully sifted, weighed, and subjected to that kind of cunning alchemy which clever women use to transmute the baser metals of sophistry into gold. Mrs. Pennington had now taken an initiative in the friendship and refused to be disconcerted. Jane's engagements with Coleman Van Duyn provided no effectual hindrance to Mrs. Pennington's enthusiastic fellowship, and she frequently helped to make a party in which, to Mr. Van Duyn at least, 3 was a crowd. Mrs. Pennington accepted his presence without surprise, without annoyance or other emotion, and somehow succeeded in conveying the impression that she was conferring a favor upon them both, a favor for which, in her own heart at least, Jane was grateful. It was not surprising to Jane, therefore, when one morning Nellie Pennington called up on the phone and made an engagement for the afternoon at 5 at the Loring house, urging a need of Jane's advice upon an important matter. She entered the library where Jane had been reading with a radiance which did much to dispel the gloom of the day which had been execrable. And when her hostess suggested that they go upstairs to her own dressing room where they might be undisturbed, Nellie Pennington threw off her furs. "No, thanks, darling," she said. "I can't stay long. And you know, when one reaches my mature years, each stair has a separate menace. There's the lift." Jane laughed. "Oh, never. That would be a public confession. I'll stay here if you don't mind." And she sank into an armchair by the fire. "Coley isn't coming?" she inquired. "No," said Jane. "I had a headache." Nellie Pennington sighed gratefully. "You know, Jane, Coley is a nice fellow, but he's just about as plastic as the Pyramid of Cheops. You've done wonders with him, of course, and he is really quite bearable now, but it must have been wearing, wasn't it?" "Oh, no," Jane smiled. "He's quite obedient. I sometimes wonder whether men are worth the pains we women waste on them." Mrs. Pennington went on reflectively. "When we are single they adore us for our defects. Married, we have a real difficulty in making them love us for our virtues. But love abhors the word obedience. It knows no arbitrary laws. An obedient husband is like an egg without salt, and far more indigestible. You're not going to marry Coley, are you, Jane?" she finished abruptly. Jane paled, and her head tilted the fraction of an inch. It was the first time Nellie Pennington had approached the subject so directly, and Jane had not decided whether to silence her questioner at once or to laugh her off when she broke in again. "Oh, don't reply if you don't want to. I'm sure nothing I could say would have the slightest influence in your decision. It doesn't matter in the least whom one marries anyway, because whatever the lover is, the husband is always sure to be something quite different. If Coley is obedient now, married he'll be a Tartar. I didn't say I was going to marry Mr. Van Duyn." "You didn't say you weren't. Why should I? Must a girl marry because she receives the attentions?" "Exclusive attentions," put in Mrs. Pennington quickly. "Jane, you're rather overdoing it," she finished frankly. "I like Mr. Van Duyn very much," said Jane, her head lowered. "But you don't love him?" "Oh, Jane," she whispered earnestly, "play the scene in your own way if you like, but don't try to hide the real drama from me." "There is no drama," put in Jane. "It was a farce." "It's a drama in Phil Gallatin's heart. Can you be blind to his struggle?" "I care nothing for Mr. Gallatin's struggles," said Jane, her head high. "You do. Love like yours comes only once in a woman's eyes. I saw it." "You're mistaken." "No, and it isn't quenched with laughter." "Don't, Nellie." "I must. You're trying to kill something in you that will not die. It's dead now." "No, nor even sleeping." "Don't you suppose I read you, silly child, your false gaiety, the mockery of your smiles, and the way you've thrown Coley Van Duyn into the breach to soothe your pride. Even let an engagement be undenied so that Phil could think how little you cared. You once let me behind the scenes. No matter how much you regret it, I'm still there. Mr. Gallatin is nothing to me." Mrs. Pennington leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You told me that your faith in Phil was unending. Your eternity, my dear, lasted precisely 1 week." Jane flashed around at her passionately, aroused at last, as Nellie Pennington intended that she should be. Oh, why couldn't he have explained? Explain? At the expense of another girl? Phil is a gentleman. Mrs. Pennington had had that reply ready. She had considered it carefully for some days. Jane paused, and her eyes, scarcely credulous, sought the face of her visitor. Nellie Pennington met her look eagerly. "Nina Jaffray's," she went on. "Could Phil tell why it happened? Obviously not. But he kissed her." Mrs. Pennington shrugged her pretty shoulders. "As to that, Nina, of course, had reasons of her own." "Nina? Miss Jaffray? Reasons?" "She probably asked him to." "Impossible." "She did." "Do you know that?" "No, but I know Nina." "I can't see that alters anything." "But it does, amazingly. If you'll only think about it." "I saw it all." "Oh, did you? I'm glad." "Glad? Oh, Nellie. Of course. Think how much worse it might have seemed if you hadn't." "I don't understand." "If someone else had told you, you might have believed anything." "I saw enough to believe." "What did you see?" He just kissed her." "Oh, Jane, think. What did you see? Why should Phil kiss a girl he doesn't love? Aren't there any kisses in the world but lovers' kisses? Think. You must. Phil's whole life and yours depend upon it." Jane rose and walked quickly to the window. "This conversation is impossible." Nellie Pennington watched her narrowly. She had created a diversion upon the flank which, if it did nothing else, had temporarily driven Jane's forces back in confusion. She looked anxiously toward the door of the drawing room and then smiled, for a figure had entered and was coming forward without hesitation. With one eye on Jane, who was still looking out of the window, Nellie Pennington rose and greeted the newcomer. "Hello, Phil. I had almost given you up. You don't mind, do you, Jane? I had to see Mr. Gallatin and asked if he wouldn't stop for me here." At the sound of his name, Jane had twisted around and now faced them breathless. Mrs. Pennington was smiling carelessly, but Phil Gallatin, hat in hand, stood with bowed head before her. At the door into the hallway, the butler, somewhat uncertainly, hovered. "Thank you, Hastings," Jane summoned her tongue to say. "That will be all." End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs, recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Intruder. And when the man had gone, her voice came back to her with surprising clearness. "You were going, I think, you said, Nellie dear. So sorry. If you'll excuse me, I think I'll hurry upstairs. I'm dining out and—" "Jane!" Gallatin's voice broke in. "Don't go. Give me a chance. Just half an hour, 10 minutes. I won't take any more than that. And then I'm sorry, but you wouldn't see me or reply to my letters, so I had to choose some other way. Give me a moment," he pleaded. "You can't refuse me that." "I don't see how anything that you say can make the slightest difference in anything, Mr. Gallatin," she said haltingly. "We both seem to have been mistaken. It's very much better to avoid a discussion which is sure to be painful to us both." "What do you know of pain?" he whispered. "If you can't know the pain of absence, nothing that you can say will hurt more than that. The pain of being ignored, forgotten for another. I have stood it as long as I can, but you needn't be afraid to tell me the truth. If you say that you love, that you're going to marry Van Duyn, I'll go, but not until then." "Mrs. Pennington is waiting for you, I think," she gasped. But when she turned and looked into the drawing room, Mrs. Pennington was nowhere to be seen. "No," he went on quickly. "She has gone. I asked her to. Oh, Jane, listen to me. I made a mistake under the impulse of a foolish moment. I've been a fool, but I'm not ashamed of my folly. Perhaps it shocks you to hear me say that, but I'm not ashamed. My conscience is clear. Do you think I could look you in the eyes if there was any other image between us? Call me thoughtless if you like, careless, inconsiderate of conventions, inconsiderate even of you. But don't insult yourself by imputing motives that never existed, that never could exist while you were in my thoughts. Oh, Jane, can't you understand? You're the life, the bone, the breath of me. I have no thought that does not come from you, no wish, no hope that you're not a part of. What has Nina Jaffray to do with you and me? If I kissed her, it was because He stopped and could not go on. "That is precisely what I want to know," she said coolly. I can't tell you." "No," she said dryly. "I thought not. Miss Jaffray has every reason to be flattered at your attitude. I can only be thankful that you at least possess the virtue of silence, that you really are man enough to preserve the confidence of the women of your acquaintance. Otherwise, I myself might fare badly." "Stop, Jane!" he cried, coming forward and seizing her by the elbows. "It's sacrilege. Look up into my eyes." "You dare not, because you know that I speak the truth, because you know that you'll discover in them a token of love unending, the same look that you've always found there, because when you see it you will recognize it as a force too great to conquer, too mighty to be argued away for the sake of a whim of your injured pride. Look up at me, Jane." He had his arms around her now, but she struggled in them, her head still turned away. "Let me go, Mr. Gallatin," she gasped. "It can never be. You have hurt me mortally. No, I'll never let you go until you look up in my eyes and tell me you believe in me." "It's unmanly of you," she cried, still struggling. "Let me go, please, at once." Neither of them had heard the opening and closing of the front door, nor seen the figure which now blocked the doorway into the hall, but at the deep tones which greeted them, they straightened and faced Mr. Loring. "I beg your pardon, Jane," he was saying with ironical amusement. "I chose the wrong moment, it seems." And then in harsher accents, as Gallatin walked toward him, "You, Jane, what does this mean?" Miss Loring had reached the end of the davenport where she stood leaning with one hand on its arm, a little frightened at the expression in her father's face, but more perturbed and shaken by the fluttering of her own heart, which told her how nearly Phil Gallatin had convinced her against her will that there was nothing in all the world that mattered except his love and hers. Her father's sudden appearance had startled her, too, for though no words had passed between father and daughter, she knew that her mother had already repeated the tale of her romance and of its sudden termination. She tried to speak in reply to Mr. Loring's question, but no words would come, and after a silence burdened with meaning, she heard Phil Gallatin speaking. "It means, Mr. Loring," he was saying steadily, "that I love your daughter, that I hope some day to ask her to be my wife." Loring came into the room, his eyes contracted, his bull neck thrust forward, his face suffused with blood. "You want to marry my daughter? You? I think you're mistaken." He stopped and peered at one and then the other. "I've heard something about you, Mr. Gallatin," he said more calmly. "Your ways seem to be crossing mine more frequently than I like." "I hardly understand you," said Gallatin clearly. "I'll try to make my meaning plain. We needn't discuss at once the relations between you and my daughter. Whatever they've been or are now, they're less important than other matters." "Other matters?" Gallatin exclaimed. Jane had straightened and come forward, aware of some new element in her father's antipathy. Loring glanced at her and went on. "For some weeks past I've been aware of the activity of certain interests that you or your pettifogging little firm represent in regard to the plans of the Pequot Coal Company. I've followed your movements with some curiosity and read the letters you've written to the New York office with not a little amazement." "You have read them?" "Yes, I am the Pequot Company, Mr. Gallatin." Gallatin drew back a step and glanced at Jane. "I was not aware," he began. "No, I guess not. But it's about time you were." Loring chuckled. He walked the length of the room and back, his hands behind him, passing Jane as though he was unaware of her existence, his huge bulk towering before Gallatin again. "You are trying to stop the sale of the Sanborn mines," he sneered. "You're meddling, sir. We tested that matter in the courts. The court records." "Your courts, Mr. Loring?" put in Gallatin, now thoroughly aroused. "I'm familiar with the evidence in the case you speak of." "My courts!" Loring roared. "The Supreme Court of the state. We needn't discuss their decisions here." "No, but we will discuss them elsewhere," he said soberly. He stopped and with a quick change of voice, "Mr. Loring, you'll pardon me if I refuse to speak of this further. I'm sorry to learn that—" "I'm not through yet," Loring broke in savagely, with a glance at Jane. "We've known for some time that the Sanborn case was in the hands of Kenyon, Hood and Gallatin, and we've been at some pains to keep ourselves informed as to any action that would be taken by your clients. We know something about you, too, Mr. Gallatin, and we have followed your recent investigations with some interest and not a little amusement. If we ever had any fear of a possible perversion of justice in this case, through your efforts, I may say that it has been entirely removed by our knowledge of your methods and of the personal facts of your career. Father! Jane's fingers were on his arm, and her whisper was at his ear, but he raised a hand to silence her, putting her aside. You're aligning yourself with a discredited cause, sir. Your case is a bubble which I promise to prick at the opportune moment. The tone of your letters requesting an interview with a view to reopening the case is impertinent. The compromise suggested is blackmail and will be treated as such. Gallatin flushed darkly and then turned white at the insult. Mr. Loring, I'll ask you to choose your words more carefully, he said angrily, his jaw set. I'm not in the habit of mincing words, and I'll hardly spare you or the people who employ you for the sake of a foolish whim of a girl, even though she is. You must not, Father, whispered Jane again in tones of anguish. You're in your own house. You're violating all the... Be quiet, he commanded shortly, or leave the room. I can't be quiet. Mr. Gallatin, for the present, is my guest, and as such... Whatever Mr. Gallatin's presence here means, there's little doubt. I asked him to come here, Jane stammered. I beg you to leave us. No. If Mr. Gallatin has come here at your invitation, all the more reason that you too should hear what I have to say to him. I will not listen. Will you please go, Mr. Gallatin, at once? Phil Gallatin, pale but composed, was standing immovable. Thank you. If there's something else your father has to say, I'll listen to it now, he said. I can only hope that it will be nothing that he will regret. Jane drew aside and threw herself on the divan, her head buried in her hands. There's hardly a danger of that, said Loring grimly. I'll take the risk anyway. I'm in the habit of keeping my house in order, Mr. Gallatin, and I'm not the kind to stop doing it just because a duty is unpleasant. There seems to be something between you and my daughter. God knows what. I have known it for some days, but I haven't spoken of it to her or hunted for you because I had reason to believe that she had had the good sense to forget the silly romantic ideas you had been putting into her head. I see that I was mistaken. Your presence in this house is the proof of it. I'll try to make my objections known in language that not only you but my daughter will understand. With a struggle, Gallatin regained his composure, folded his arms and waited. Jane raised her head, her eyes pleading, then quietly rose and walking across the room, laid her fingers on Phil Gallatin's arm and stood by his side, facing her father. Mr. Loring began speaking, but she interrupted him quickly. Whatever you say to Philip Gallatin, Father, you will say to me. Whatever you know of him, I know too, past or present. I love him, she finished solemnly. One of Gallatin's arms went around her and his lips whispered, "Thank God for that, Jane." And then together they faced the older man. Mr. Loring flinched, and some of the purple went out of his face, but his lower lip protruded and his bulk seemed to grow more compact as the meaning of the situation grew upon him. His small eyes blinked 2 or 3 times and then glowed into incandescence. "Oh, I see," he muttered. "It's as bad as that, is it? I hadn't supposed." "Wait a moment, sir," said Gallatin clearly. "Call it bad if you like, but you haven't a right to condemn me without a hearing." Loring laughed. "A hearing! I know enough already, Mr. Gallatin." Gallatin took a step forward, speaking quietly. "You're making a mistake. Whatever you've heard of me, I've at least got the right of any man to defend himself. You've already chosen to insult me in your own house. I've passed that by because this is not the time or place to answer. Kenyon, Hood and Gallatin are not easily intimidated, nor am I. I want you to understand that here. Now," his voice fell a note, "when I speak of myself, it is a different matter. I don't know what you've heard about me, and I don't much care, for in respect to one thing at least, I'll offer no excuse or extenuation. That's past, and I'm living in the hope that as time goes on, it will not be borne too heavily against me. But you've got to believe, whether you want to or not, that I would rather die than have your daughter suffer because of me. She has suffered already." "No, no," cried Jane. "Not suffered, only lived, father." "And now you've quit, I suppose," said the old man ironically. "Reformed, turned over a new leaf. See here, Mr. Gallatin, this thing has gone far enough. I've listened to you with some patience. Now you listen to me. You've come into my house unbidden, invaded my privacy here, and insinuated yourself again into the good graces of my daughter, who I had good reason to believe had already forgotten you. Your training has served you well. Fortunately, I'm not so easily deceived. Until the present moment, I have trusted my daughter's good judgment. Now I find I must use my own. If she isn't deterred by a knowledge of your history, perhaps I can supply her with information which will not fail. I can hardly conceive that she will overlook your conduct when it involves the reputation of another woman." "Father!" Henry Loring had reached the drawing room door and now stood, his legs apart, his fists clenched, his words snapping like the receiver of a wireless station. "Deny, if you like. It will have no conviction with me or with her. Look at her, Mr. Gallatin," he said, finger pointing. "There are limits even to her credulity. She will hardly be pleased to learn of the accident to the motor which obliged you and your companion very opportunely indeed to spend the night in a—" "Stop, sir!" Gallatin's hand was extended and his voice dominated. "Say what you like about me. I've invited that. But I'll not listen while you rob a woman of her name." Jane stood like an ivory figure in the pale light, her eyes dark with incomprehension, searching Gallatin's face for the truth. "There was a woman?" she asked. Gallatin hesitated. "Yes, there was a woman. There needn't be any mystery about that. I wasn't aware that there had been any mystery. It was Nina Jaffray. We were stranded back in the country, coming from the Pot and Kettle. We found a farmhouse and stayed there. There wasn't anything else to do. You can't mean that you believe—" Jane had turned from him and walked toward the door. "It hadn't been my intention to mention the lady's name," Loring laughed. "But since Mr. Gallatin has seen fit to do so—" "You're going too far, Mr. Loring. There are ways of reaching a man even in your standing in the community." Loring chuckled. "I fancy that this is a matter which won't be discussed elsewhere," he said. Gallatin's eyes sought Jane's, who now stood in the doorway into the hall, one hand clutching the silken hangings. "You can't believe this, Jane? You have no right to. Your father has been told a sinful lie. It's doing Nina a harm, a dreadful harm. Can't you see?" At the mention of Nina's name, Jane's lips twisted scornfully, and with a look of contempt she turned and was gone. Gallatin took a few steps forward as though he would have followed her, but Loring's bulky figure interposed. "We've had enough of this, sir," he growled. "Let's have this scene over. We're done with you. You've played H with your own life, and you'll go on doing it, but you won't play it with me or with any of mine. By gee, I've got your measure, Mr. Gallatin, and if I find you interfering here again, I'll take some other means that will be less pleasant. D'ye hear? I've heard the story they're telling about you and my daughter up in the woods. It makes fine chatter for your magpies up and down the avenue. D them. Thank God, my daughter is too clean for them or you to hurt. It was a great chance for you. You knew what you were about. You haven't lived in New York all these years for nothing. You thought you could carry things through on your family name. But to make the matter sure, you tried to compromise my daughter so that—" Loring paused. Gallatin had stood with head bowed before the door through which Jane had disappeared. His ears were deaf to Loring's tirade. But as he realized the terms of the indictment, he raised his head, stepped suddenly forward, his fists clenched, his eyes blazing into those of the older man, scarcely a foot away. In Phil Gallatin's expression was the dumb fury of an animal at bay, a wild light in his eyes that was a personal menace. Loring did not know fear. But there was something in the look of this young man who faced him which told him he had gone too far. Gallatin's right arm moved upward and then dropped at his side again. "You've said enough, Mr. Loring," he gasped, struggling for his breath. "Almost more than is good for both, for either of us. You're mistaken, sir." And then, as though ashamed of his lack of control, he turned aside and took up his hat. Henry Loring strode to the wall and pressed his thumb to a bell. "I'll stand by my mistakes," he said more calmly. "You came to the wrong house, Mr. Gallatin, and I think you won't forget it. I'd like you to remember this, too, that I'm a man of my word. You keep your fingers off my affairs, either business or personal, or I'll make New York too hot to hold you." And then as the man appeared, "Hastings, show this gentleman out." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of The Silent Battle by George Gibbs. Recording by Tony Oliva. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Temptation. Philip Gallatin had a bad night. From the Loring house he trudged forth into the rain and sleet of the park, where he walked until his anger had cooled, then dined alone in a corner at the Cosmos, avoiding a group of his familiars who were attuned to gaiety. From there he went directly to his rooms. The house of his fathers was in a by-street in the center of the fashionable shopping district, and this dwelling, an old-fashioned double house of brown stone was the only relic that remained to Phil of the former grandeur of the Gallatins. Great lawyers, however successful in safeguarding the interests of their clients, are notable failures in safeguarding the interests of their own. Philip Gallatin, the elder, had inherited a substantial fortune, but had added nothing to it. He had lived like a prince and was known as the most lavish host of his day. He consorted with the big men of his generation when the Gallatin house was famous alike for its cellar and kitchen. Here were entertained presidents and ex-presidents of the United States, foreign princes, distinguished artists and literary men, and here it was claimed, over Philip Gallatin's priceless Madeira, the way had been paved for an important treaty with the Russian government. Philip Gallatin II had made money easily and spent it more easily, to the end that at the time of his death it was discovered that the home was heavily mortgaged, and that his holdings in great industrial corporations, many of which he had helped to organize, had been disposed of, leaving an income which, while ample for Mrs. Gallatin and her only child during the years of his boyhood, when the taste of society was for quieter things, was entirely inadequate to the growing requirements of the day. At his mother's death, just after he came of age, Phil Gallatin had found himself possessed of less than $8,000 a year gross, and a mortgage which called for almost one half that sum. But he resolutely refused to part with the house, for it had memories and associations dear to him. 3 years ago, with a pang which he still remembered, he had decided to rent out the basement and lower floors for business purposes and apply the income thus received to taxes and sinking fund. But he still kept the rooms on the third floor, which he had always occupied, as his own. An old servant named Barker, one of the family retainers, was in attendance. Barker had watched the tide of commerce flow in and at last engulf the street which in his mind would always be associated with the family which he had served so long. But he would not go, so Philip Gallatin found a place for him. In the building he was janitor, engineer, rent collector, and valet. He cooked Phil's breakfast of eggs and coffee and brought it up to him, made his bed and kept his rooms with the same scrupulous care that he had exercised in the heyday of prosperity. He was Phil's doctor, nurse, and factotum, and kept the doors of Gallatin's apartments against all invaders. Phil Gallatin wearily climbed the 2 long flights which led to the rooms. He had had a trying day. All the morning had been spent with John Sanborn, and a plan had been worked out based upon the labors of the past 3 weeks. One important decision had been reached, and a concession wrung at last from his clients. He had worked at high tension since the case had been put into his hands, traveling, eating when and where he could, working late at the office, sleeping little, and in spare moments had written to or thought of Jane. The strain of his anxiety was now beginning to tell. The events of the afternoon had filled him with a new sense of the difficulties of his undertakings. Loring would fight to the last ditch. All the more glory in driving him there. But of Jane he thought with less assurance. His own mind had been so innocent of transgression, his own heart so filled with the thought of her, that her willingness to believe evil of him and of Nina had caused a singular revulsion of feelings which was playing havoc with his sentiments. It had not mattered so much when Jane's indictment had been for him alone. That he had deserved and had been willing to stand trial for. But with Nina's reputation at stake, Jane's intolerance took a different aspect. Whatever Nina Jaffray's faults, and they were many, Phil Gallatin knew, as everyone else in the Cedarcroft crowd did, that they were the superficial ones of the day and generation, and that Nina's pleasure was in the creation of smoke rather than flame. The failure of the motor after the pot and kettle party had been unfortunate, and the lack of oil subsequently explained by the drunkenness of the chauffeur, who had been discharged on Miss Jaffray's return to town. Phil Gallatin had found a farmhouse where Nina had been made comfortable. There was no gasoline within 5 miles of the place. The chauffeur was unable to cope with the situation, and there was nothing for it but to wait until morning, when the farmer himself drove Gallatin to the nearest village for the needed fuel. Under other circumstances it might have been an amusing experience, but the events of the evening had put a damper on them both. Nina's impudence was smothered in her fur collar, and she had sat sulkily through the hours of darkness, gazing at the stove, saying not a word, and the delinquent chauffeur had meanwhile gone to sleep on the floor of the kitchen. Morning saw them safe in town at an early hour, and it had been at Nina's request that the incident had not been mentioned. Until today, Gallatin had not given it a thought. He had not seen Nina, and while he had frequently thought of her, the flight of time and the press of affairs had given her singular confession a perspective that took something from its importance. But Jane's attitude had suddenly made Nina the dominant figure in the situation. Whatever mischief she had created in his own affairs, she had not deserved this. He entered his rooms filled with bitterness toward Henry Loring, dull resentment toward Jane. Everything in the world that he hoped for had centered about her image, and he loved her for what she had been to him, what she had made of him, and for what he had made of himself. But in his mind a definite conviction had grown that in so far as he was concerned, their relations were now at an end. He had abased himself enough, and further efforts at a reconciliation could only demean his dignity, already jeopardized, and his pride, already mortally wounded. He threw himself heavily into his Morris chair and tried to think about other things. Upon the table there was a legal volume which he had brought up from the office the night before, filled with slips of paper for the reference pages which Tooker had placed there for him. He took it up and began to read, but his mind wandered. The type swam before his eyes, and in its place Jane's face appeared, ivory colored as he had last seen it, and her eyes, dark with pain and incomprehension, looked scornfully out of the page. He closed the book and gazed around the room, into the dusty corners with their mementos of his career. The ore that had been his when he had stroked the crew of his university. Boxing gloves, foils and mask, photographs of football teams in which he had been interested, a small cabinet of cups, golf and steeplechase prizes, a policeman's helmet, the spoils of a college prank, his personal library. His father's was in a storage warehouse, trinkets of all sorts, steins innumerable, a tiny satin slipper, some ivories, and a small gold flask. He got out of his chair, picked the flask up, and examined it as if it had been something he had never seen before. He ran his fingers over the chasing of the cup, noted the dents that had been made when it had fallen among the rocks, and the dark scar made in the embers of their fire. Their fire, his fire and Jane's, burned out to ashes. He put the flask back in its place and began slowly to pace the floor, his hands behind his back, his head bent forward, his eyes peering somberly. He stopped in his walk and put a lump of coal into the grate. He was dead tired, and his muscles ached as though with a cold. In the next room his bed invited him, but he did not undress, for he knew that if he went to bed it would only be to lie and gaze at the gray patch of light where the window was. He had done that before, and the memory of the dull ache in his body during the long night when he had suffered came to him and overpowered him. He had that pain now, coming slowly, as it had sometimes done before when he had been working on his nerve. It didn't grip him as once it had done, with its clutch of fire driving everything else from his thoughts, but he was conscious that the craving was still there, and he knew that the thing he wanted was the panacea for the thoughts that oppressed him. By its means all the aches of his body would be cured, and the pain of his thoughts. Yes. He stopped at the table and took up a cigarette. But there was one thing in him, one thing more important than physical pain, than physical exhaustion or singing nerves. One small celestial spark that he had kindled, fostered and tended, which had warmed and comforted his entire being, the glow of his returning self-respect. And this thing he knew, if those physical pangs were cured, would die. He took up his measured tread of the floor, counting his footsteps from window to door and back again, watching the patterns in the rug and picking out the figures upon which he was to put his feet. Once or twice his footsteps led him as though unconsciously to the cabinet in the corner, where he stopped with a short laugh. He had forgotten that there was no panacea there. Later on he rang the bell for Barker, only to remember that the man had gone away for the night. He wanted someone to talk to, someone, anyone who could make him forget. What was the use? What did it matter to anyone but himself if he forgot or not? What was he fighting for? For himself? Yesterday and the days before he had been fighting for Jane, fighting gladly, downtown in his clubs, at people's houses, in the enemy's country, where the enemy was to be found at every corner, at his very elbow, because he knew that nothing could avail against his purpose to win Jane back to him. Now he had no such purpose. Jane had turned from him because someone had lied about him, turned away and left him here alone in the dark with this hideous thing that was rising up in him and would not let him think. He went to the table and filled a pipe with trembling fingers. A terror oppressed him, the imminence of a danger. It was the horror of being alone, alone in the room where this thing was. He knew it well. It had been here before and it had conquered him. It lurked in the dark corners and grinned from his bookshelves and laughed in the crackling of his fire. "Come," he could hear it say, "don't you remember old Omar? Come, fill the cup and the fire of spring, the winter garment of repentance fling. The bird of time has but a little way to fly, and lo, the bird is on the wing. His pulses throbbed and his head was burning, though a cold sweat had broken out on his brows and temples, and his feet were cold, ice cold. The tobacco had no taste, and it only parched his throat the more. He stumbled into the bathroom and bathed his head and hands in the cold water and drank of it in huge gulps. That relieved him for a moment, and he went back to his chair and took up his book. His sickness came back upon him slowly, a premonitory faintness and then a gripping, aching fire within. The book trembled in his hands and the type swam in strange shapes. He clenched his fingers, threw the book from him and rose with an oath, reaching for his hat and coat and stumbling toward the door, downstairs less than a block away. Beside the bookcase he caught a glimpse of his image in the pier glass. He stopped, glared at himself, and straightened. "Where are you going, D.N.U.? Where? Like a thief in the night? Look at me. You can't. Where are you going?" There was no answer but the laughter of the flames and the sneer of a motor in the avenue. His hand released the knob and he turned back into the room, with eyes staring, teeth set and face ghastly. "No, by Gee, you'll not go, Phil Gallatin, not from this room tonight. Not for that. Do you hear? You'll fight this thing out here and now." He dropped his coat and hat and strode like a fury to the window. There he lay across the sill and, throwing the sash open wide, drank the night air into his lungs in deep breaths. In a moment the crisis had passed. After a while he closed the window, came back into the room and sank into his chair, utterly exhausted. His mind comprehended dully that he had fought and won, not for Jane, nor for his future, but for that small fire that was still glowing in his breast. He closed his eyes and relaxed his clenched fingers. His nerves still tingled, but only slightly, like the tremor of harp strings in a passing storm. He was very tired, and in a moment he fell asleep. When he awoke, the light of dawn was filtering in at the windows. The lamp had gone out. He struck a match and made a light. It was 6 o'clock. He had slept 7 hours. He yawned, stretched himself, and looked at his disordered reflection in the mirror, suddenly awake to the beginning of a new day. The aches in his body had gone, and his mind was clear again. He leaned forward upon the mantel and silently apostrophized his image. "You're going to win, Phil Gallatin. Do you hear? You're not afraid. You don't care what the world says. You're not fighting for the world's opinion. It's only your own opinion of yourself that matters a D.N. If you win that, you've won everything in the world worth winning." He laughed pleasantly and his image smiled back at him. "Salut, monsieur. You're a good sort after all. You've got more sand than I thought you had. I'm beginning to like you a great deal. You can look me in the eye now, straight in the eye. That's right. We understand each other." He faced around into the room which had been the scene of so many of his failures and of his last and greatest success. The light from the windows was growing brighter. It was painting familiar objects with pale violet patches, glinting on glassware and porcelain like the cold light of intellect, which now dominated the merely physical. He swept the room with a glance. Before the light, the shadows were fading. The enemy. There, was no enemy. Gallatin poked down the embers of the fire and heaped on wood and coal. He stripped to his underclothes, did 20 minutes with dumbbells and chest weights, and then went in to draw his bath, singing. He soused himself in the cold water and came out with chattering teeth, but in a moment his body was all aglow. "It's a good body," he mused as he rubbed it. "A perfectly good body, too good to abuse. There's a soul inside there, too, where nobody seems to know, but it's there and it isn't in the stomach, and that's a sure thing, though that's where the stomach thinks it is. We'll give this body a chance, if you please. A square deal all around." He chuckled and thumped himself vigorously, as though to assure himself of the thoroughness of his recuperation. 7 o'clock found him on the street walking vigorously in the direction of the park. He knew that there was no chance of meeting Jane Loring at this hour of the morning, but he chose the west side, that he might not even see the marble mass where she was sleeping, for the memory of what had happened there yesterday rankled like an angry wound. He breakfasted at the Cosmos at 8, and before 9 was at the office, where he finished the morning mail before even Tooker and the clerks were aware of his presence there. There were many threads of the Sanborn case still at a loose end, and he spent a long while writing and dictating to his stenographer, who was still at his side, when at about 11 o'clock the office boy brought in Nina Jaffray's card. He was still looking at it when Nina entered. "I was afraid you might be busy, Phil," she said calmly, "but I wanted to see you about something." He nodded to his stenographer and she took up her papers and went. "The mountain wouldn't come to Mahomet, and so do sit down, Nina. I'm not interrupting you very much, am I?" He laughed. "No, I'm glad you came, if only to prove to my friends that I really do work." "Oh, is that all?" "No, I'm glad to see you for other reasons." "I'm curious to know them." "To be assured, for one thing, that you've forgiven me for my boorishness." "Oh, that. Yes, of course." "And for another, that your mood will spare me the pains of further making a fool of myself." Nina shrugged lightly and laughed at him. "Of course you know your limitations, Phil. How could I promise you that?" Gallatin smiled at her. She was very fetching this morning in a wide dark beaver hat with a lilac veil, and her well-cut tailor-made, snugly fitting in the prevailing mode, defined the long lines of her slim figure, which seemed in his office chair to be very much at its ease. "Will you be serious?" "In a moment. For the present I'm so overjoyed at seeing you that I've forgotten what I came for. Oh, yes, Phil, I'm hopelessly compromised and you've done it. Don't laugh and don't alarm yourself. You're doing both at the same time. But I really am seriously compromised. There's a story going around that you and I—" "Yes, I've heard it," he said grimly. "What interest people can possibly discover in the mishaps of a belated platonic couple in a snowstorm is more than I can fathom. Of course, if there had been anything for them to talk about, I'd have come off scot-free. As it is, I'm pilloried in the marketplace as a warning to budding innocence. Imagine it, me! I'm everything that's naughty, from Eve to Guinevere. It would be quite sad if it wasn't so amusing. Weren't we the very presentment of amatory felicity? Can't you see us now, swathed in our fur coats, sitting like two bundled mummies upon each side of that monstrosity they called a stove? The parlor heater, That was the name, from Higgins and Harlow, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, done in nickel at the top. Can't you see us sitting upright on those dreadful haircloth chairs, silent and so miserable? That, my dear Philip, was the seductive hour in which I fell from grace. Touching picture, isn't it?" Gallatin refused to smile. "Who told this story, Nina?" "The chauffeur, probably. I discharged him the next day." "Of course. That was it. But it's such a silly yarn. Who will believe it?" She threw up her hands in mock despair. "Everyone, unfortunately. You see, Coley Van Duyn didn't help matters any by telling about your kissing me on the stairs." "D.N. him," said Phil through his teeth. "Besides, I've been careless of their opinion for so long that people are only glad to get something tangible." "But it isn't tangible. That farmer out there could." Nina raised her hand. "Denial is confession, my dear. I shall deny nothing. I shall only smile. In my saddest moments the memory of Higgins and Harlow's parlor heater with its nickel icicles around the top will restore my equanimity. I don't think I've ever before really appreciated the true symbolism of the nickel icicle." Gallatin had risen and was pacing the floor before her. "This gossip must be stopped," he said, scowling at the rug. "If I can't stop it in one way, I can in another." "And drag my shattered fabric through the rumpus? No, thanks. J'y reste. The rôle of martyr becomes me. In my own eyes I'm already canonized. I think I like the sensation. It has the merit of being a novel one, at any rate." "Nina, do stop talking nonsense," he put in impatiently. "I'm not going to sit here placidly and let them tell this lie." "Well?" Nina leaned back in her chair and tilted her head sideways. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'll make them answer to me personally. It was my fault. I ought to have walked home, I suppose." "But you didn't. That's the rub. They won't answer to you personally anyway. At least nobody but the chauffeur, and he might do it unpleasantly." "I'll thrash him. I'll break his " "No, you won't. It wouldn't do the least bit of good. And besides, it would make matters worse if he thrashed you. There's only one thing left for you to do, my friend." "What?" "Marry me." Phil Gallatin stopped pacing the floor and faced her, frowning. "You still insist on that joke?" "I do. And it's no joke. It seems to be the least thing that you can do under the circumstances." "Oh, is it?" "Of course. You wouldn't leave things as they are, would you? Think of my shrinking susceptibilities, the atrocious significance of your negligence. Really, Phil, I don't see how you can refuse me." Gallatin laughed. He understood her now. "I'm immensely flattered. I'll marry you with great pleasure." "Oh, thanks." "If I ever decide to marry anyone." "Phil!" She glanced past him out of the window, smiling. "And you're not going to marry anyone?" "No." "I was afraid you might be." She rose and took up her silver bric-a-brac, which clanked cheerfully. She had learned what she came for. "Oh, well, I won't despair. I'm not half bad, you know. Think it over. Some day, perhaps." "It would be charming, I'm sure," he said politely. "And Phil," she paused. "What?" "Come and see a fellow once in a while, won't you? You know, propinquity is love's alter ego." "I'm sure of it. Perhaps that's why I'm afraid to come." She laughed again as she went out, and he followed her to the door of the outer office where Miss Crenshaw and Miss Gillespie scrutinized her perfectly appointed costume and then tossed their heads the fraction of an inch. adjusted their side combs and went on with their work. Chapter 22.